Ash falls without making sound. It settles on leaves, on riverbanks, on the hides of animals moving nervously beneath a dimming sky. Far away from the source of the eruption, beyond mountains and forests and plains no human mind can yet map. The world has begun to change color. The sun is still there, but it comes through the haze as a pale disk, weakened and strange, as if the day itself has grown tired. In some places, rain carries the ash into streams. In others, cold creeps into seasons that once had a rhythm people could trust. Animals alter their paths. Fruit trees fail. Shellfish beds shift beneath uneasy tides. The old signs become harder to read, and somewhere inside this changing world, small groups of humans keep moving. They do not know they're part of a story that will one day be called one of the most important migrations in human history. They do not know that their footprints, scattered tools, broken shells, and faint genetic traces will become evidence in a mystery tens of thousands of years later. They do not know that. Scholars will debate whether disaster nearly erased them, whether only a narrow branch of humanity survived outside Africa, whether climate, chance, hunger, and distance cut their numbers down so sharply that the future of billions may have passed through a bottleneck no wider than a few wandering bands. To them there is no grand map. There is only the next source of water, the next safe shelter, the next animal track, the next child who must be carried when the ground is too rough. The world is immense, but their world is close. It is skin, stone, smoke, breath, weather, memory. It is the smell of wet ash after rain. It is the unease of elders who remember when certain valleys held more game. It is the pressure of hunger when the familiar plants fail at the wrong time. It is the silence after a herd does not return. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The migration that nearly wiped us out is not a simple tale of brave people walking from one continent to another. It is a story written in absences, missing camps, drowned coastlines, bones that never fossilized, populations that vanished before they could leave a name. It is also written in survival because every person alive today carries some part of the answer inside their body. Not as a memory, not as a legend, but as DNA shaped by ancient movements, ancient losses, and ancient meetings with other kinds of humans who were already waiting in the wider world. For a long time it was tempting to imagine the expansion of Homo sapiens as a clean arrow drawn on a map. Africa here, Arabia there, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, Europe, eventually the rest of the planet. A line moving outward, confident and inevitable. But the real story is not an arrow. It is more like a tide pushing into a broken coastline, advancing, retreating, dividing, disappearing into channels, then returning in forms difficult to trace. Some groups likely moved out and failed. Others may have lived beyond Africa for generations, then vanished without contributing much or anything to later populations. Some routes opened only when climates softened, when deserts turned green, when lakes spread across places now dry and silent. Other routes closed again, leaving people trapped between sea, sand, and cold. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were never simply marching toward destiny. They were testing the edges of survival. The background to this story is deep time, but not so deep that the people disappear into abstraction. By around 300,000 years ago, early forms of Homo sapiens are present in Africa. Their bodies are becoming more like ours. Their skulls, faces, and limbs carry the signs of a lineage that has been evolving across a continent of shifting grasslands, woodlands, wetlands, and deserts. Africa is not a single cradle in the simple sense. It is a vast changing homeland, and human origins may have been shaped by populations spread across different regions, connected at times and isolated at others. Scholars still debate exactly how these populations interacted, but the old idea of one small birthplace giving rise to everyone in a straightforward sequence has become too narrow for the evidence. Long before the famous migration that gave rise to most non-African ancestry today, humans and human relatives were already restless. Older hominins had left Africa before us. Homo erectus and related forms had spread into Eurasia long before Homo sapiens existed. Neanderthals occupied Western Eurasia. Denisovans known first from a fragment of fingerbone and a few teeth in Siberia left genetic traces across Asia and Oceania. Other populations still poorly understood may have lived in places where the fossil record is thin, and the climate destroys bone. By the time Homo sapiens begins to push beyond Africa in more lasting ways, the world is not empty. It is already inhabited by cousins. That makes the migration more haunting, not less. The humans leaving Africa are not entering a vacant stage. They are entering an ancient human world filled with other experiments in survival. Some have adapted to cold lands, some to high mountains, some to forests and islands. The newcomers bring their own ways of making tools, reading landscapes, forming groups, sharing knowledge, and perhaps telling stories around fire. But they are not guaranteed success. Intelligence does not cancel hunger. Language does not stop drought. Fire does not make a bad coastline safe. A child with a modern human brain can still die from an infected cut, a failed season, a storm crossing, or a missing herd. The central mystery begins with a contradiction. Homo sapiens eventually becomes the last surviving human species, spreading farther than any earlier hominin, crossing seas, deserts, mountains, ice margins, and tropical forests. Yet, genetic evidence points to moments when our numbers were small, sometimes extremely small, especially among the populations that left Africa and became ancestors of people outside it. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for this. But the pattern is clear enough to disturb the easy story of unstoppable expansion. The people who made it were not numerous conquerors. They were survivors of filters. One of those filters may have been climate. The late Pliene world is unstable, swinging through colder and warmer phases, wetter and drier intervals, landscapes opening and closing like doors. Arabia, now often imagined as desert, was not always so forbidding. At times, monsoon rains pushed farther north, filling lakes and supporting grasslands. At other times, the same region hardened into a barrier of heat and aridity. The Sahara, too, shifted between green corridors and vast obstacles. The routes out of Africa were not permanent roads. They were opportunities, and opportunities can vanish. Another filter may have been catastrophe. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba super-eruption in what is now Indonesia blasted enormous amounts of volcanic material into the atmosphere. It was one of the largest eruptions of the Quaternary period. For decades, researchers have debated how severely it affected global climate and human populations. Some earlier hypotheses suggested a dramatic volcanic winter and a severe human bottleneck. Later evidence has complicated that picture. Sites in Africa and India suggest continuity of human occupation across the ash layer in some regions, and the idea that Toba alone nearly wiped out humanity is not accepted as a simple fact. Yet, it remains a powerful event in the story because it shows the scale of hazards early humans lived through. Even if Toba did not bring humanity to the brink by itself, it unfolded in a world already shaped by unstable climates and fragile populations. The ash, then, is both literal and symbolic. Literal because volcanic ash from Toba can be found across parts of Asia, a pale geological signature of an eruption so vast it marked landscapes thousands of kilometers away. Symbolic because the human story around that ash is partly hidden. Did people see skies dim for seasons? Did rainfall patterns shift? Did already small groups suffer more in some places than others? Did some routes become harder just as others became possible? The answers are uneven. The evidence does not allow a neat disaster movie. It offers something more unsettling, a patchwork of resilience and disappearance. In one valley, people may have continued making tools much as before. Along one coast, they may have adapted to altered shorelines and marine resources. In another region, a small group may have dwindled until no descendants remained. Archaeology is better at finding persistence than silence, because silence leaves little behind. A successful camp can produce stone flakes, hearths, bones, shells, pigments, and burials. A failed migration may leave almost nothing, especially if its camps lay on coastlines now drowned under rising seas. Much of the route early humans may have taken along the southern edge of Asia is no longer land. It lies beneath water, buried under sediment, beyond the easy reach of excavation. This is why the migration feels like a mystery even when the broad outline is accepted. We know humans left Africa. We know they encountered and interbred with other human groups. We know they reached Australia by at least around 0 to 65,000 years ago, depending on which evidence is emphasized. We know Europe saw a major modern human presence after roughly 45,000 years ago. We know all non-African populations today descend largely from a population that passed through a bottleneck after leaving Africa, but the lived experience of that passage remains shadowed. The people at the center of it were not thinking in continents. They were following water, animals, kin, memory, and possibility. Imagine a small band near a shoreline during one of the lower sea level periods of the Ice Age. The coast is not where it is today. The continental shelves are exposed, broad and rich in places with tidal flats, reefs, estuaries, and mangroveic environments depending on latitude and climate. Shellfish can be gathered by children and elders. Fish can be trapped in pools. Birds nest nearby. Marine foods provide a kind of reliability that inland landscapes may not. This is part of the coastal migration hypothesis, though scholars still debate how central it was and how much evidence has been lost beneath the sea. It is not hard to see why coastlines would matter. They are corridors of food and movement. But they are also dangerous, changeable, and easily erased from the archaeological record. Now imagine the same band after a bad season. The shell beds are thinner. Fresh water is farther away. Another group has already taken the best shelter. A child is sick. The elders disagree without words preserved for us. Should they stay near known resources or move toward a place remembered from a journey years earlier? Should they cross an exposed channel at low tide? Should they follow birds inland? These decisions are invisible in the record, yet they are the real machinery of migration. Not heroic lines on a map, but ordinary choices made under pressure. The phrase "nearly wiped us out" can be misleading if imagined as a single moment when all humanity stood at the edge of extinction. The more accurate and more interesting version is layered. Humanity as a whole may have passed through periods of reduced population and regional vulnerability, but the most dramatic narrowing seems especially important for the ancestors of non-African peoples. The migration out of Africa was not a mass exodus. It was likely carried by small groups, and small groups are vulnerable to chance. A storm, a disease, a conflict, a drought, or a run of failed births can reshape their future. If a group is isolated, its loss is final. In genetics, a bottleneck is not a story of panic. It is a pattern left when a population becomes small enough that later descendants carry only a limited sample of the earlier diversity. Outside Africa, human genetic diversity is generally lower than within Africa, reflecting the fact that the groups who left carried only part of the variation present in the larger African homeland. That does not mean they were weak or primitive. It means they were few. It means the future passed through a narrow gate. There is a strange intimacy in that. The vastness of later human history, cities, languages, ships, temples, empires, farms, songs, wars. Migrations layered upon migrations may depend on the survival of people who never numbered enough to fill a modern village. Their world could be lost in a day's walk. Their possessions could be carried by hand. Their knowledge lived in bodies and gestures and remembered roots. If a skilled toolmaker died before teaching a child, a technique might vanish. If a grandmother remembered a dry season waterhole, her memory could mean survival. If a group met strangers and exchanged partners, information, or genes, the future changed. The ancient migration was not only a movement through space. It was a movement through risk. It unfolded while climates pulsed. Volcanoes erupted. Sea levels shifted. Deserts breathed in and out. And other human species occupied lands beyond the African horizon. It nearly failed. Not because humans lacked ability, but because ability was never enough. The world was larger than them. The margins were thin. The evidence we have is powerful but incomplete, and the gaps are not empty. They are part of the story. So the ash keeps falling in the imagination, even where the real ash has long since been buried. It falls over stone tools in India, over lake beds in Africa, over coastlines now drowned, over caves where bones survived and open-air camps where nothing did. It falls over the old assumption that our rise was inevitable. It reminds us that the human past is not a staircase climbing neatly upward. It is a landscape of losses, detours, failed crossings, vanished cousins, and a few lines of descent that somehow continued. The people moving through that dim world do not know they are carrying the future. They know only that the air tastes wrong, that the animals are restless, that the old paths cannot always be trusted. They move because staying can be dangerous, and because movement itself is one of the oldest human answers to uncertainty. Somewhere ahead are coastlines, deserts, mountains, other humans, unknown animals, and lands no member of their group has ever seen. Somewhere behind them is Africa. Not as a memory of origin in the modern sense, but as the living source of their bodies, their tools, their ancestors, and their ways of reading the world. And between those two realities lies the narrow passage through which almost all later human history must squeeze. Long before the dangerous road beyond Africa becomes visible in the archaeological record, there is Africa itself, not a background, not a starting point to be left behind quickly, but the enormous living world in which Homo sapiens is shaped. To understand why the later migration is so precarious, it helps to linger there for a while in the deep homeland, where rivers shift across ancient basins, grasslands expand and contract, forests gather around water, deserts breathe in slow climatic cycles, and human populations learn to survive by adapting not to one environment, but to many. The people who will one day move beyond Africa are not born from stillness. They come from a continent of movement. Africa in the age before the Great Departure is not one simple landscape. It is a mosaic so large that any single image betrays it. In the north, the Sahara is sometimes a vast barrier and sometimes a greener region of lakes, rivers, wetlands, and animals. In the east, rift valleys hold lakes that rise and fall as climates change, leaving shorelines like old scars on the land. In the south, coastal zones, shrublands, caves, and river systems offer different resources to groups who know how to use them. In central regions, forests and open habitats shift their boundaries over time. Across all of this, early Homo sapiens populations are not merely enduring nature. They are being made by it. By around 300,000 years ago, fossils from places such as Jebel Ehud in Morocco show human-like forms with a mixture of modern and archaic traits. Their faces look surprisingly familiar in some ways, while their skull shapes still carry older features. Other fossils from eastern and southern Africa add to the picture, though not in a perfectly neat sequence. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how to define the earliest Homo sapiens. But one thing has become increasingly difficult to deny. Our species did not appear suddenly in one small garden-like birthplace. It emerged across a broad African setting through populations that may have been separated for long periods and reconnected when climate opened pathways between them. This matters because it changes the emotional shape of the story. Humanity does not begin as a single spark in one valley. It begins more like a network of embers spread across a dark landscape, some glowing brighter at certain times, some nearly fading, some joining again when winds shift. Groups develop local adaptations, local tool traditions, local knowledge of animals, plants, stone sources, water, and season. They may not all look identical, they may not all behave in identical ways, yet over immense spans of time, enough connection exists for a wider human lineage to form. What survives in the record suggests a braided origin, not a clean line. The old homeland is therefore already full of bottlenecks and expansions before anyone reaches Eurasia in a lasting way. Population groups grow when climates are generous and shrink when drought or ecological change tightens the world. A lake that once supported fish, birds, reeds, and grazing animals may contract, forcing people to move or change diet. A grassland may give way to scrub. A river corridor may fail. A coastline may become more important during inland stress. In such conditions, survival belongs not simply to the strongest individuals, but to flexible groups with memory, cooperation, and the ability to shift strategies before hunger becomes fatal. The surprising detail is that some of the most important human abilities may have been sharpened not in stable abundance, but in instability. A predictable paradise does not require much innovation. A changing world rewards attention. It rewards those who remember that a certain plant is edible only after processing. That shellfish are exposed at a particular tide. That stone from a distant outcrop flakes better than local rock. That smoke can drive insects from a shelter. That ochre can be ground and carried. That social bonds with neighboring groups can become a kind of insurance when one region fails. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of modern human behavior, but variability itself seems to be part of the pressure. In Africa, signs of this growing complexity appear unevenly and sometimes disappear again. Stone tools become more refined in some traditions. Points, blades, scrapers, and prepared cores show planning and skill. In southern Africa, sites such as Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point preserve evidence that later researchers interpret as symbolic behavior. Pigment use, careful exploitation of marine resources, and sophisticated technologies. At some sites, people heat stone before flaking it, improving its quality in a way that requires controlled fire, patience, and understanding born from repeated experiment. These details can feel small until one imagines the hands behind them. A person chooses a stone, heats it without ruining it, strikes it at the right angle, and turns geology into survival. But this is not a simple march toward modernity. The archaeological record flickers. A behavior appears in one region, then is absent elsewhere, or seems to vanish for thousands of years before reappearing. This does not necessarily mean people forgot in a dramatic sense. It may reflect changing needs, lost evidence, different materials, or population shrinking and losing traditions. Culture is fragile when carried by small numbers. A toolmaking method can disappear if too few apprentices remain. A symbolic practice can leave no trace if it uses wood, fiber, skin, sound, or body paint. The past preserves stone better than memory, which is unfortunate because memory may have been the most important tool of all. Before the Great Migration, Africa also contains the deepest genetic diversity of our species. This is one of the strongest clues to the continent's central role. Populations living there have had far longer to accumulate variation, split, mix, and adapt. Later groups outside Africa carry only a subset of that diversity because they descend from smaller migrating populations. The difference is not a measure of human worth or complexity. It is a demographic shadow. Africa is the deep reservoir. The later migration is a sampling event powerful precisely because it is limited. And yet these African populations are not isolated from the rest of the world forever. There were earlier movements beyond Africa before the main expansion that produced most later non-African ancestry. Fossils from the Levant, including places such as School and Kufsi, show Homo sapiens outside Africa long before the later global spread. These earlier groups reached the eastern Mediterranean region during favorable periods, perhaps when climates allowed passage through what would otherwise be difficult country. But their long-term fate is uncertain. They may have retreated, disappeared, or been absorbed into later populations in ways still difficult to detect. Their presence is a reminder that leaving Africa happened more than once, and not every departure succeeded. That is one of the most important tensions in the story. The road out was not discovered once, and then followed forever. It opened and closed. Human groups pushed into borderlands and sometimes failed to endure there. The Levant, sitting between Africa and Eurasia, became a kind of ecological gate, sometimes green enough to invite movement, sometimes harsh enough to halt it in warm, wet phases. Animals moved north and east, and humans could follow familiar habitats in dry phases. The same route could become a trap. The landscape itself decides when the door is open. From the perspective of later history, it is easy to treat the humans who remained in Africa and the humans who left as two branches of a finished diagram. But at the time there is no such division. There are only communities in motion, sometimes connected by exchange and mating, sometimes separated by distance or climate. A group near the Red Sea may know of lands across water or along the coast through rumor-like chains of contact. A group in the Nile corridor may move north during a humid interval. A group in southern Africa may never encounter those frontier populations at all, yet still be part of the broader story of a species learning flexibility. The future is not yet divided into continents and ancestries. It is still a field of possibilities. The human body itself carries signs of this flexible past. Compared with many earlier hominins, Homo sapiens has a lighter skeleton, a rounded skull, a flatter and smaller face, and a brain arranged in ways that support complex social and symbolic life. But bodies alone do not explain survival. A modern human body without knowledge is helpless in a hard landscape. The true inheritance of Africa is not just anatomy. It is learned behavior: where to find water, how to make tools from different stones, how to cooperate across kin networks, how to divide labor without rigid simplicity, how to carry infants while foraging, how to read animal movement, how to heal, how to mourn, how to remember. There's also likely a growing ability to imagine places not immediately visible. Migration requires more than walking. It requires mental maps. Even if those maps are not drawn, they live in stories, gestures, landmarks, and seasonal routines. A ridge leads to a spring. A dry valley floods after distant rains. A certain bird means water is not far. A line of hills marks the direction of stone. Such knowledge can be shared, corrected, expanded. In this sense, Africa before the departure is a continent of invisible maps carried in heads and bodies, revised each generation. Some of these maps may have pointed outward. The Red Sea narrows in places. The Sinai and Levant connect Africa to Eurasia. The Bab el-Mandeb, strait between the Horn of Africa and Arabia, may have been less daunting during lower sea levels. Though still not a simple walk, across these thresholds lay unfamiliar lands, but not necessarily unimaginable ones. Animals crossed when conditions allowed. Coastal resources continued. Clouds, birds, currents, and distant landforms may have hinted at possibilities. The evidence for exact routes remains debated, but the geography makes clear that Africa was not sealed. It was edged with doors. Still, a door is not the same as a safe passage. A group leaving a familiar region loses more than scenery. It loses the accumulated certainty of generations. Plants may look similar but behave differently. Stone may fracture poorly. Water may be seasonal in unfamiliar ways. Predators may follow different patterns. Neighboring human groups may be absent, hostile, or simply unknown. The deeper a group moves into new country, the more it depends on improvisation. That is why the migration is so dangerous. The skills forged in Africa are powerful, but they must now be applied beyond the landscapes that shaped them. The ancient homeland also reminds us that us in this story is complicated. Not all human ancestors left Africa. Not all who left survived. Not all who survived contributed equally to later populations. African populations continued their own deep histories with migrations, innovations, mixtures, and transformations that are just as important as the story beyond the continent. The Great Departure is not the moment humanity begins. It is one narrowing thread pulled from a much richer fabric. To mistake the thread for the whole cloth is to misunderstand the past. So, before the ash-darkened skies and the contested catastrophe of Tober, before the drowned coastlines and the meetings with Neanderthals and Denisvan, there is this older world, a continent of lakes that vanish and return, deserts that bloom and close, caves with pigments and shell beads, open plains with hunters reading hoofprints, coastlines where people learn the rhythm of tides, and scattered populations whose connections are written faintly in bone, stone, and genes. The people who will one day step beyond Africa carry all of that with them. They carry the continent not as a flag or an idea, but as muscle memory, inherited variation, practice, skill, and social knowledge. When they do not leave as masters of the planet. They leave as one fragile expression of a much larger African story. Their ancestors have survived instability for hundreds of thousands of years, but the world ahead will test that inheritance in new ways. Beyond the familiar horizons are corridors that open only briefly, deserts that can turn lethal, other humans who have their own ancient claims to the land, and disasters large enough to mark the sky. The road outward begins not with triumph, but with a question the evidence still asks quietly. How many times did humans try to leave before one thin line of descendants finally made it through? The idea that a species as widespread as ours could once have lived close to the edge is difficult to hold in the mind. Modern humans seem almost impossible to erase. They fill cities, deserts, islands, mountains, floodplains, forests, and frozen regions. They travel in aircraft above oceans that once stopped entire worlds of life. They store food, write records, preserve seeds, build machines, and surround themselves with layers of protection unknown to the people of the deep past. Yet beneath all of that abundance lies a narrower and more vulnerable history. The human story is not only a story of expansion, it is also a story of contraction. Before the great movement beyond Africa becomes permanent, human populations are already shaped by pulses of growth and decline. A favorable climate can spread grasslands and lakes across regions that were once dry, drawing animals and people into newly usable spaces. Then the climate shifts again, and those same spaces become traps. Waterholes shrink, herds move away, plants fail, groups that had spread out must retreat, merge, or disappear. This rhythm does not produce a smooth population curve. It produces scattered communities, some thriving for a time, others reduced until only a few families remain. Scholars still debate the size and timing of ancient population bottlenecks. But the genetic record leaves little doubt that our ancestors passed through periods when numbers were far smaller than they are today. A bottleneck sounds technical, almost bloodless, but it represents something intensely human. It means fewer births, fewer elders, fewer skilled hands, fewer memories of distant water and safe crossings. It means a group may lose not only people, but options. If only a handful survive a hard season, they carry forward only a fraction of the variation, knowledge, and social ties that once existed. The lost are not statistics. They are missing voices around fires, missing foragers who knew which roots could be eaten, missing toolmakers, missing children who never grew old enough to teach the next generation. In genetics, this narrowing can be detected because small populations pass only limited variation to their descendants. Africa retains the deepest genetic diversity. Because human populations there are older and more complex with longer histories of separation and reunion. Outside Africa, diversity is reduced, suggesting that the ancestors of non-African peoples passed through a smaller founding population. That founding population was not necessarily tiny in one dramatic instant, and the evidence remains incomplete, but it was small enough to leave a lasting mark. Every later expansion across Eurasia, Oceania, and eventually the Americas grows from that reduced sample. The unsettling part is that this narrowing may have happened more than once. Some researchers have proposed ancient bottlenecks affecting early Homo sapiens within Africa, perhaps linked to climate instability, fragmented habitats, or long-term ecological pressures. Others emphasize the bottleneck associated with the out-of-Africa migration itself. These are not always competing ideas. A species spread unevenly across changing landscapes can experience regional collapses, local expansions, founder effects, and later mixtures. The path does not need one crisis to be fragile. It can be fragile repeatedly. For people living through it, a bottleneck is not visible as a population graph. It arrives as daily pressure. A group that once met neighboring bands at seasonal gathering places may find that no one comes. A valley where children learn to dig tubers may dry before the plants mature. A hunting route may become unreliable because the animals have shifted with rainfall. A fever may pass through a camp and remove the adults best able to navigate a hard landscape. A birth may go badly. A quarrel may split a group when staying together would have been safer. Chance becomes more powerful when numbers are small. Small groups also face a problem that later civilizations often forget. Knowledge can die. In a large population, if one expert toolmaker, healer, tracker, or navigator is lost, others may preserve the skill. In a group of 20 or 30, the loss of one person can erase a whole technique. A method for preparing poison, heating stone, treating hides, reading tides, or locating dry season water may depend on one or two living teachers. This is one of the lesser-known dangers of prehistoric life. Extinction is not always the sudden death of all bodies. Sometimes it begins with the quiet disappearance of know-how. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies have long noticed that complex skills require social transmission. They are learned slowly through observation, correction, and repetition. A stone point is not simply struck into shape by instinct. A child watches the angle of the blow, the placement of the hand, the selection of stone, the patience to discard a flawed piece, fire use, plant processing, trapping sewing, and navigation all depend on culture as much as anatomy. If a population shrinks too far, cultural loss can make biological survival harder, which then causes further shrinking. No single explanation fully accounts for ancient human vulnerability. But this feedback between demography and knowledge may have mattered deeply. This is why the migration beyond Africa was so risky. A small founding group entering unfamiliar territory carries only a portable version of its world. It carries bodies, tools, memories, and social rules. But it cannot carry the full safety net of a larger population. If the group loses contact with others, marriage partners become limited. Genetic drift becomes stronger. Inbreeding risks may rise if isolation lasts too long. Cooperation becomes essential. But cooperation is also strained by hunger, fear, and uncertainty. The group must move enough to find resources, but not so recklessly that it walks into ecological emptiness. Climate makes this more difficult. During the late Pleistocene, Earth is not locked into one stable ice age scene. It swings. Ice sheets grow and retreat. Monsoon systems shift. Sea levels fall as water becomes trapped in ice, exposing coastal plains and land bridges, then rise again during warmer periods. Deserts expand and contract. In Africa and Arabia, humid intervals create corridors that can support movement while arid intervals close them. The route out of Africa may look possible for a few thousand years, then become punishing again. For archaeology, a few thousand years is a layer. For human beings, it is hundreds of generations. A population moving through such windows may spread quickly when conditions are good, only to fragment when they worsen. Some groups remain near coasts where marine foods offer relative stability. Others follow rivers or lake systems inland. Some may push into Arabia during green phases and vanish when aridity returns. Others may reach the Levant and encounter climates and competitors unlike those of their homeland. What survives in the record suggests repeated attempts, not one clean breakthrough. The success of the later migration may be built on many earlier failures. The fossil record offers hints of this stop-and-start movement. Homo sapiens remains appear in the Levant long before the major later expansion. Yet these early populations do not seem to lead straightforwardly to all later non-Africans. Their presence shows capability, but capability is not destiny. They reach beyond Africa, live there perhaps for long periods, and then their trace fades. The reasons are uncertain. Climate may have turned against them. Neanderthal populations may have occupied some of the same regions in later phases. Small numbers may have made them vulnerable to disappearance. The evidence does not allow a dramatic ending, only a quiet one. Quiet endings are common in prehistory. A site stops being used. A tool tradition disappears. A genetic lineage leaves no descendants. There is no written record of the last campfire. No account of whether people died, moved, merged, or changed beyond recognition. Archaeology often finds beginnings more easily than endings, because a beginning may leave a distinctive new layer, while an ending is simply absence. The story of being nearly wiped out is partly a story of those absences accumulating around the few lines that survived. The phrase nearly wiped out also belongs to different scales. Homo sapiens as a species may never have come within one bad week of total extinction, in the way a small island species might. The situation is subtler and more scientifically interesting. Certain populations, especially the ancestors of later people outside Africa, appeared to have passed through severe narrowing. Other human populations, including many within Africa, continued with their own complexity. At the same time, broader ancient reductions may have affected our species' diversity. The danger is real, but it is not a single cartoon cliff edge. It is a landscape full of cliffs, some visible, some hidden by fog. For the migrating groups, the greatest threat may have been the combination of small numbers and unfamiliarity. In a known homeland, even hardship has patterns. People know where water sometimes remains, where animals go in drought, which plants can be eaten in famine, which neighboring groups might help or at least trade. Beyond the old ranges, uncertainty multiplies. A coastline may seem generous until a storm destroys shell beds. A river may appear permanent but vanish in the dry season. A cave may shelter people but also predators. A plant may resemble an edible one from home and prove dangerous. Every decision carries more risk when knowledge is thin. And yet small groups also possess strengths. They can move quickly. They can adapt their diets. They can split and rejoin. They may be less tied to heavy possessions or fixed places. Their survival depends on attention, not infrastructure. This flexibility is one reason humans endure. But flexibility is not magic. A group cannot adapt to resources it cannot find, diseases it cannot withstand, or isolation that lasts too long. The human advantage is powerful only when enough people remain to use it. One of the most haunting possibilities is that many early human journeys ended without leaving descendants. They may have been brave, skilled, and fully human, yet their line disappeared. Some may have reached lands later occupied by successful waves. Some may have met Neanderthals or other human relatives and exchanged genes that were later lost. Some may have survived for thousands of years, which feels long from a modern perspective, yet still vanished before becoming part of the main ancestry of living populations. Deep time is cruel in this way. It can make a long human world look temporary. The genetic record preserves only the winners of survival in a limited sense. Not the morally superior, not necessarily the most intelligent, but the lineages that happen to continue. Many others are invisible. This creates a distorted impression as if the surviving path was the intended one. But the ancient world was full of possible futures: a slightly harsher drought, a failed crossing, a disease spreading through a small population, or the loss of contact between groups could have changed the ancestry of later humanity beyond recognition. The fact that one line survived does not mean survival was inevitable. There is an old temptation to imagine human evolution as a story of progress. With Homo sapiens rising steadily toward global dominance, the bottleneck breaks that illusion. It reveals how much of our history depends on fragility. The ancestors of later non-Africans may have carried only a small portion of the variation found in Africa. They entered lands where other humans had already adapted for hundreds of thousands of years. They moved through climates that could turn from generous to lethal. Their numbers were low enough for chance to matter, and still somehow they persisted. That persistence is not a roar. It is quieter. It is the repair of a stone edge beside a fire when the air is cold. It is a group waiting for the tide to expose food. It is a mother carrying a child across ground where no one knows the next water source with certainty. It is an elder remembering that beyond a ridge there may be a valley where animals gather after rain. It is the decision not to stop, or the decision to stop at exactly the right place. It is survival made from small acts repeated under pressure. By the time the story reaches the threshold of the Great Eruption, the human world is already narrow in important ways. Groups have grown and shrunk. Earlier expansions have left uncertain traces. Knowledge has flickered across landscapes. The road beyond Africa has opened before and closed again. Humanity is not a young species by then, but it is still vulnerable, and the migrating branch is especially exposed. Then into this already unstable world, a volcano on the far side of the ocean tears open with a force almost beyond imagination, throwing ash across the sky, and leaving later scientists to ask whether one disaster helped tighten the bottleneck even further. The volcano is far from the first human roads, but distance does not always mean safety. On the island now called Sumatra, beneath a landscape of forested slopes and hidden pressure, magma has been gathering in quantities almost impossible to picture. For generations, nothing in the daily lives of distant human groups would have pointed clearly to this place. People moving through Africa, Arabia, India, or the shores of Southeast Asia would not have known that a mountain system far away was becoming part of their story. The Earth gives warnings, perhaps, but not in a language that can travel across continents. Then, around 74,000 years ago, Toba erupts. It is not merely a mountain exploding. It is a planetary event. The eruption releases an immense volume of ash and volcanic material. One of the largest eruptions known from the Quaternary period, and its signature spreads across wide regions of Asia. The sky darkens near the source. Ash buries landscapes. Fine particles rise high into the atmosphere where they can influence sunlight, temperature, and rainfall. The caldera left behind will one day hold Lake Toba. a vast blue surface resting inside the wound of the eruption, peaceful enough to make the violence that created it feel almost unreal. For humans living through it, the scale is unknowable. No one sees the whole event. No one has a satellite image, a global climate model, or a name for sulfur aerosols. A group close enough to receive heavy ash might experience it as the collapse of the familiar world. Day becomes strange. Breathing becomes painful. Water turns foul. Leaves and fruits are coated. Animals flee or die farther away. The effects may be subtler but still frightening. Cooler seasons, altered rains, failed plants, confused animal movements, a dimness that lingers. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how severe these effects were in different regions. But even a moderate climatic shock would have mattered deeply to small populations already living near ecological limits. For decades, Tauber became linked to one of the most dramatic ideas in human prehistory: that the eruption nearly wiped out Homo sapiens, reducing humanity to a tiny surviving population and leaving a genetic bottleneck still visible today. It is a powerful idea, almost too powerful because it gives the mystery a single dark center. One eruption, one volcanic winter, one near extinction. The world darkens, humans vanish. A few survivors remain and all later history descends from them. It has the simplicity of legend, and that is exactly why it must be handled carefully. The mainstream picture today is more complicated. Genetic evidence does show ancient bottlenecks, especially in the populations that expanded beyond Africa, but connecting those bottlenecks directly and solely to Tauber is difficult. Archaeological evidence from some regions suggests continuity across the eruption. In parts of India, stone tool assemblages appear below and above the Tauber ash, implying that human or hominin populations in those landscapes did not simply disappear in Africa. Evidence likewise does not support a universal total collapse of human life immediately after the eruption. No single explanation fully accounts for the genetic patterns, the archaeological continuities, and the uneven environmental effects. Tauber was enormous, but enormous does not automatically mean globally fatal, and yet dismissing Tauber entirely would also be a mistake. The eruption may not be the sole cause of a human bottleneck, but it remains one of the great stress events in the world, through which our ancestors moved. Its effects would not need to be uniform to be important. A volcanic event can devastate some regions, disrupt others, and barely register in places where local ecosystems are buffered by water, coastlines, or diverse food sources. For a large, well-connected population, such patchiness might be survivable with limited long-term effect for scattered small groups. Patchiness is destiny. One valley continues, another ends. Imagine a group living downwind of the ashfall, not close enough to be buried instantly, but close enough for the land to become hostile. The first ash may look like pale dust, perhaps mistaken for something local until it keeps coming. It gathers on skins and hair. It turns tracks vague. It coats edible leaves. It settles into pools and makes water bitter. Birds vanish from certain trees. Grazing animals move away from coated grass. A child coughs. A hunter wipes his eyes and finds the air still stinging. The group can wait, but waiting consumes food. They can move, but movement into unknown territory costs strength. There is no clean choice, only a narrowing of bad options. This is where catastrophe becomes human scale. The eruption does not need to kill directly to alter survival. It can push animals out of reach, reduce plant foods at the wrong season, contaminate water, or force groups into contact and competition. It can make already risky migration routes more dangerous. It can break the timing of familiar cycles. Many prehistoric communities survive by knowing when things happen. When a river falls, when shellfish are exposed, when herds pass, when fruit ripens, when storms come. A climate shock disrupts not just resources, but calendars carried in memory. One lesser-known detail is that volcanic ash can become an archaeological marker, a thin pale horizon that allows researchers to connect sites across vast distances. The Tauber ash layer, where preserved, works almost like a timestamp laid across the landscape. Beneath it, one world, above it, another. But the layer does not speak clearly by itself. It must be read alongside tools, sediments, pollen, animal remains, and dating methods, each with uncertainties. In some places, continuity across the ash suggests resilience. In others, gaps may reflect abandonment, erosion, poor preservation, or real population decline. The ash gives scientists a line, but not a simple story. The older Toba catastrophe hypothesis proposed that the eruption caused a severe volcanic winter lasting years, perhaps driving humans through an extreme bottleneck. Later studies have challenged the strongest version of this claim. Climate models vary. Archaeological sites do not show one global human collapse. Some ecosystems may have recovered faster than once imagined. Still, the debate itself reveals something important about prehistory. Scientists are trying to connect evidence from radically different scales: a volcanic caldera in Indonesia, microscopic ash particles in sediments, stone tools in India, genetic diversity in living people, climate signals from ice and ocean cores, human survival inferred from what little remains. The problem is not lack of imagination. It is the difficulty of proving exactly how a planetary event entered the lives of small mobile bands. The people themselves left no written account of a darkened sky. Their bones are rare. Their camps may lie underwater or under meters of sediment. Their genetic legacy may have been overwritten by later expansions. The event is huge. The human traces are tiny. Between them lies the gap where uncertainty lives. Still, the timing is hard to ignore. Toba erupts near a period when modern humans are beginning or perhaps preparing to expand beyond Africa in ways that will eventually reshape the world. Some groups may already be outside Africa. Others may still be near the thresholds. Climatic instability is already part of the background. Sea levels, monsoons, deserts, and coastlines are changing. If a major eruption adds even a temporary shock to that system, it may influence which groups persist, which routes remain viable, and which populations become isolated. The effect may be less like a single hammer blow and more like an extra weight placed on a structure already under strain. In Africa, the consequences may have varied dramatically by region. Coastal communities with access to marine foods may have been buffered in ways inland groups were not. Wetlands, lakes, and diverse habitats may have offered resilience. Dry regions may have become harsher. Groups with broad diets and flexible movement patterns may have endured better than those dependent on narrower seasonal resources. What survives in the record suggests that humans were capable of remarkable adaptation. But adaptation always has limits. A flexible diet helps only if enough edible resources remain. Mobility helps only if there is somewhere better to go. Beyond Africa, the situation may have been even more precarious. Small groups in South Asia or along coastal corridors could have faced ashfall more directly if they were already few. Even moderate mortality or displacement could erase entire local lineages. Their disappearance would not necessarily leave an obvious archaeological silence, especially if other groups later occupied the same regions. A later tool layer can make a landscape look continuous, even if the people using it are not the same descendants. Archaeology can show that humans were present before and after, but proving uninterrupted population continuity is harder. This distinction matters. A region can remain inhabited while one population is replaced, absorbed, or reduced beyond recovery. The land continues to hold tools. Fires continue to burn, but the genetic thread may change. In deep time, survival is not simply whether someone remains in a place. It is whether a particular line continues into the future. Toba may have ended some lines while leaving others untouched, and the record may never let us identify all of them. The eruption also forces a larger question about vulnerability. How close did humans need to be to disaster for a single event to matter? A species spread widely in large populations can absorb regional catastrophe. But Homo sapiens at this time is not yet a global species. It is still mostly African, with uncertain and perhaps fragile extensions beyond the continent. Its total numbers may be modest. Its groups are small. Its technologies are impressive but portable and perishable. Its survival depends on local knowledge and social bonds. In such a world, even a temporary global disturbance can have long shadows. There is something almost unfair about the timing. After hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in Africa, after earlier tentative expansions into the Levant, after the slow accumulation of tools, fire skills, symbolic practices, and flexible diets, the wider world begins to open, and then the sky itself becomes a hazard. But prehistory is not arranged for fairness. It is arranged by geology, climate, chance, and endurance. The same species that can imagine distant places can still be brought low by ash in the water. Toba's most important role in the story may be not that it nearly exterminated humanity by itself, but that it exposes how dangerous the ancient migration already was. A catastrophe does not create fragility from nothing. It reveals it. If populations are small, scattered, and moving through uncertain corridors, then volcanic winter, ash fall, or disrupted rainfall can become decisive in some places. If human networks are strong, diverse, and connected, they can absorb shocks. The debate over Toba is therefore also a debate over the resilience of early Homo sapiens, and the evidence points in both directions. Humans were resilient enough to persist across the eruption. That is clear, they did not vanish. Tool traditions continued in some regions. African populations survived. Eventually humans spread across the planet. But resilience is not the same as invulnerability. Some groups may have disappeared forever. Some routes may have closed. Some surviving populations may have been reduced, forced together, or pushed into new strategies. The human line that continues may have done so, through a corridor of losses we can only partly see. When the ash finally settles, the world does not reset. Landscapes recover unevenly, rains return in altered patterns, plants regrow where soil and climate permit. Animals recolonize, rivers clear, people where they survive, adapt their movements to the changed world. Children born after the eruption may know the ash only as a layer in the ground or as a memory carried by elders, but the consequences of such events can outlast direct experience. A group displaced from one region may never return. A weakened population may merge with another. A route abandoned for a few generations may be forgotten. A lost lineage leaves no one to remember that it ever existed. The Great Eruption therefore remains suspended between fact and mystery. The fact is geological. Toba erupted with extraordinary force and spread ash across a vast area. The mystery is human. How deeply did it cut into the lives and numbers of our ancestors? The strongest versions of the old catastrophe theory have softened under newer evidence. Yet the eruption still belongs in the story, because it was part of the world through which the Great Migration passed. It is a reminder that human destiny was not unfolding in calm conditions. It was moving beneath unstable skies. As the haze thins, the survivors face a world that is not simply ruined, but rearranged. Some landscapes are harsher, some may slowly recover, some corridors may close, while others, shaped by rainfall and sea level, may open again. Human groups continue to move, not because movement guarantees survival, but because stillness can be just as deadly. The road beyond Africa remains uncertain, and ahead of it lies a geography that behaves almost like a living thing. Deserts that bloom and die, rivers that appear and vanish, coastlines that stretch outward during low seas, and green passages that invite people forward before closing behind them. After the ash, the map is still alive. It does not lie flat and obedient like the maps later humans will draw on skins, paper screens, and classroom walls. It breathes, it greens, dries, floods, hardens, opens, and closes. The ancient world through which Homo sapiens moves is not divided into fixed continents with stable borders. It is a shifting puzzle of coastlines, grasslands, river corridors, deserts, lakes, and exposed shelves of land that appear when the seas fall and vanish when the seas rise again. For a small human group standing at the edge of Africa, the difference between survival and disappearance may depend on timing, arriving when a corridor is green or reaching it after the door has already closed. The great migrations out of Africa are often imagined through two main gates. One lies to the northeast through the Nile Valley and Sinai into the Levant, where Africa leans toward Western Asia. The other lies farther south across or around the Red Sea near the Bab el-Mandeb, where the Horn of Africa faces Arabia across a narrow but dangerous passage. Both routes are plausible in different periods. Both may have been used more than once. Neither should be imagined as a permanent highway. They are thresholds controlled by climate, sea level, water, and food. Scholars still debate which route mattered most for the ancestry of later non-African populations, and the evidence remains incomplete because so much of the ancient coastal world is now underwater. The northeast route has the advantage of land. During humid phases, the Nile corridor and the Levant can become inviting with rivers, wetlands, grasslands, and animals that humans know how to follow. This is the region where earlier Homo sapiens reached places like school and Kafs, long before the later successful expansion. Their presence there proves that humans could leave Africa in favorable windows, but it also shows how fragile those windows were. Those early populations did not simply sweep onward to fill Eurasia. Their trace fades. Perhaps the climate turned colder or drier. Perhaps Neanderthals, already adapted to parts of Eurasia, occupied the region more successfully in later periods. Perhaps small numbers and isolation did what they so often do in prehistory. What survives in the record suggests opportunity than silence. The southern route is more mysterious. During periods of lower sea level, the Bab-el-Mandeb crossing would have been narrower than today, though not necessarily easy. Currents, winds, reefs, tides, and the need for some form of water crossing would still make it a serious challenge. But beyond it lay Arabia, and Arabia was not always the desert that modern imagination often supplies. At certain times, strengthened monsoon systems brought rain deep into the peninsula. Lakes formed in basins that are now dry. Rivers cut across landscapes now marked by sand and gravel. Grasslands supported animals, and where animals moved, humans could follow. Arabia in these humid windows may have been less a barrier than a bridge. This is one of the surprising details hidden beneath modern geography. Deserts can be archives of vanished abundance. In parts of Arabia, ancient lakebeds preserve stone tools, animal remains, and sediments that speak of wetter times. The Arabian Peninsula has held hippos in places where today such an animal seems almost absurd. It has held freshwater systems, salve-like habitats, and routes that may once have connected Africa to Asia through landscapes rich enough to sustain human movement. No single explanation fully accounts for every wave of migration. But these green intervals are essential. They turn the impossible into the possible. The difficulty is the green corridors do not stay green. Climate pulses can make Arabia inviting for thousands of years, then close it with aridity. A group moving through during a wet phase may find lakes, grazing herds, and stone raw material. Their descendants a few generations later may face shrinking water and expanding desert. If they have moved far enough, they may continue eastward. If not, they may become trapped in isolated refuges, pushed back toward Africa, or erased. A corridor is not safe simply because it opens. It must remain open long enough for people to pass, reproduce, connect, and adapt. This gives the migration a rhythm closer to breathing than marching. During humid phases, humans and animals expand into newly usable spaces. During dry phases, they contract into refugees, river valleys, coastlines, mountain zones, springs, or lake margins that last a little longer than the surrounding land. Populations that once connected may become separated. Groups that once seemed secure may be reduced. The genetic bottleneck, associated with the out-of-Africa migration, may reflect not just one crossing, but repeated filtering through these unstable landscapes. Each environmental gate lets some people through and closes against others. For the people themselves, the green corridor is not an abstract climate phase. It is the feel of grass underfoot where elders expected gravel. It is the sound of frogs in temporary wetlands. It is hoofprints near a lake that will not exist in 10,000 years. It is a sky that brings rain often enough for plants to return. It is confidence, perhaps, because the world ahead seems to offer continuity with the world behind. The animals are not all unfamiliar. The plants are not all useless. Water can be found. Children can be fed. Movement becomes thinkable. Then comes the dead end. The lake contracts. The reeds dry. Animals leave. The distant shimmer that once meant water becomes heat. Wind reshapes the open ground. A group that moved confidently into a green Arabia may discover that the land is changing faster than their memories. Their old route back may be difficult. Their route forward may be unknown. In a large population, some groups might scout widely and maintain contact across distances. In a small one, Every exploratory journey is a risk. A lost scout is not easily replaced. A wrong turn can cost a family line. The same pattern appears in North Africa. The Sahara has not always been the vast dry barrier it is today. During African humid periods, monsoon rains pushed northward, creating lakes, rivers, wetlands and grasslands across regions now dominated by desert. Animals moved through these landscapes, and humans followed. At other times, the Sahara expanded into a formidable obstacle, separating populations. The continent's internal connection shifted. Groups that could once exchange genes and knowledge across broad regions might become isolated when dryness returned. This means that even before humans left Africa, climate was already sorting populations into contact and separation. The Red Sea coast may have offered another kind of corridor. Coastal environments can provide rich and varied resources. Shellfish, fish, birds, turtles, edible plants, and fresh water where streams or springs meet the sea. During lower sea levels, shorelines moved outward, exposing broad shelves that are now drowned. A group following such a coast would not need to cross endless desert all at once. It could move from resource patch to resource patch, living at the edge between land and water. This possibility has become central to some models of southern dispersal, though the evidence is difficult to recover because the most important camps may now lie beneath the sea. That drowned evidence is one of the great frustrations of the story. If early humans used coastal routes intensively, many of their traces are hidden under modern oceans, hearths, shell mittens, stone tools, temporary shelters, footprints, and burial places may have been swallowed as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. The archaeological record we have may be biased toward inland sites and caves simply because they survived above water. The absence of coastal evidence in some regions may not mean people were absent. It may mean their world is submerged. Still, coastlines are not perfect solutions, they change. Storms can destroy camps, fresh water can be scarce along dry coasts, shellfish beds can be seasonal or locally depleted. Groups following a coast may become trapped between sea and desert if inland resources fail, and a shoreline route still requires social knowledge. Where to find drinkable water when tides expose food, which shellfish are safe, how to avoid dangerous marine animals, how to move children and tools across rough terrain. The coast is a corridor, but like every corridor in this story, it is also a test. There is a temptation to choose one route and declare it the true path: north through Sinai, south across the Sea, inland through green Arabia, or along the coast of the Indian Ocean. But the ancient world was probably messier. Different groups may have tried different routes at different times. Some movements may have failed completely. Some may have left faint genetic or archaeological traces later overwritten by other expansions. The successful ancestry of most non-African peoples may come largely from one major dispersal, but that does not erase the earlier attempts. The map was explored repeatedly and many explorers vanished from the future. This is where geography becomes almost tragic. A route can be real and still lead nowhere for a particular group. A green corridor can open just long enough to lure people into it, then close around their descendants. A coastline can sustain movement for centuries, then drown the evidence. A river can guide a population into new land, then dry into a chain of isolated pools. The land is not malicious, but it does not preserve human hopes. It offers conditions, and conditions change. For small migrating groups, the most dangerous moments may have come at the edges of these corridors. The beginning of a humid phase opens landscapes, but resources may still be patchy. The end of a humid phase is worse. People may have spread into regions that are now becoming unsustainable. If they cannot reconnect with larger populations, their numbers may fall. Some may retreat toward known refuges. Others may move forward into unknown territory, simply because going back is no longer possible. Migration may sometimes be chosen, but often it is forced by the slow violence of a drying world. The tools left behind in Arabia and surrounding regions show that humans or close human relatives were present during some of these windows. Stone artifacts near ancient lakes suggest repeated occupations, but stone tools cannot always tell us exactly who made them, how long they stayed, or whether they contributed to later populations. A point a flake, a core. Each is a hard survival of a soft human world. It marks presence, not destiny. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how to connect these archaeological traces with genetic lineages. What is clear is that the migration beyond Africa was not one simple act of leaving. It was a negotiation with a changing planet. Humans moved when rain made deserts porous. They paused where water gathered. They followed animals through temporary grasslands. They used coasts when inland routes failed. They retreated when conditions hardened. They returned when the world softened again. The Great Departure was less like crossing a border and more like passing through a series of gates, each one guarded by climate, and behind each gate, numbers mattered. A large connected population can survive a closed route by waiting, trading, shifting territory, or drawing support from neighbors. A small group at the far edge of its known world has fewer choices. If a green corridor closes behind it, isolation begins. If the land ahead does not provide enough food, decline follows. If another human population already occupies a refuge, conflict or absorption may occur. Every environmental transition becomes a demographic filter. So the ancient road out of Africa is not just a path of expansion. It is a path of disappearance. For every group that moved through a favorable corridor and left descendants, others may have entered the same kind of landscape and failed. Their tools may lie under dunes or underwater. Their genes may be gone. Their stories, if they had them, dissolved with the last people who remembered. The surviving migration is therefore surrounded by ghosts, not supernatural beings, but lost possibilities, human futures that nearly happened and then did not. As the climates shift and the corridors open again, one branch of Homo sapiens begins to move in a way that will endure, whether through the northeast, the south, the coast, the interior, or some combination still debated. They pass beyond Africa's old horizon and into a wider world. They carry with them the memory of green places, the fear of dry ones, the habits of foragers shaped by instability, and the fragile strength of small groups. The map ahead is still uncertain. Arabia may feed them or starve them. The coast may guide them or erase them. The deserts may close behind them. But the movement continues, and with each step away from the deepest homeland, the future becomes both larger and more dangerous. Beyond Africa, uncertainty becomes the true landscape. The people moving outward may still recognize the shapes of survival around them. Water, stone, animal trails, edible roots, shellfish, shelter, firewood, shade. But recognition is no longer the same as certainty. The farther they travel from the deep homeland, the more each familiar sign requires testing. A plant that looks useful may be bitter or poisonous. A spring may vanish by the next dry season. A valley may funnel animals beautifully in 1 month and become empty in another. Stone may look promising until it breaks badly under the hammer. The world ahead is not blank, but it is untranslated. They're not explorers in the modern sense. They're not moving toward a known destination. They do not know there is a vast Asia ahead, or an Australia beyond dangerous water, or a Europe where cold-adapted cousins live in caves and open camps. Their movement is made of smaller decisions. Follow the shore a little farther. Stay near the lake until the herds leave. Cross the dry plain before the heat worsens. Return to the last good water if the children weaken. Avoid the place where another group was seen. Move when the old camp begins to fail. Migration at ground level is not a single journey. It is a chain of necessities. The first lands beyond Africa may have offered comfort during humid intervals. Arabia, when green, could feel less like an alien world than an extension of familiar habitats, grasslands, lakes, rivers, animals moving through open country. Yet even then, the scale of exposure is enormous. A group entering such a corridor has to remain close enough to resources while also continuing to find new ones. If they move too slowly, the climate may close around them. If they move quickly, they risk outrunning knowledge. Every generation born farther along the route inherits a world its grandparents did not fully know. This is one reason the out-of-Africa migration is so difficult to reconstruct. It was not one camp, one road, one people, or one moment. It was a spreading of small groups through changing environments with some branches ending and others continuing. The genetic evidence points to a major expansion that contributes most ancestry to later non-African populations, but archaeology shows that humans or human-like toolmakers were present in some regions at earlier times. Scholars still debate how these traces fit together. Some may represent early Homo sapiens expansions that left little or no ancestry in living people. Others may belong to different human relatives. The stones remain, but the makers are often gone. To imagine this movement clearly, it helps to remove the straight line from the map. A line from East Africa to Arabia to India to Southeast Asia is useful for textbooks but misleading for lives. Real movement follows uneven terrain. It bends toward water. It pauses at abundance. It avoids dangerous emptiness. It doubles back after failure. It splits when groups separate. It reconnects when paths cross again. It is possible that some families remained in a favorable region for many generations before their descendants moved farther. It is possible that others crossed large distances quickly along coastlines or river systems. The evidence remains incomplete and both slow settlement and rapid pulses may have occurred in different places. What they carry matters because it limits and enables everything. Their tools are made mostly from stone, bone, wood, plant fiber, hide and fire. Stone survives best, so stone dominates the record, but it was probably only part of their material world. Spears, digging sticks, baskets, cords, nets, bags, sleeping mats, containers, traps, and clothing or wraps may have been essential. Yet most vanish without trace. A group can travel only with what it can carry, repair, remake, or remember how to make from local materials. This creates a portable culture, light enough to move, complex enough to survive. Fire is central. It gives warmth, light, protection, cooked food, and a place around which social life can concentrate. But fire also requires fuel, skill, and attention. In damp regions, keeping embers alive may matter. In dry regions, fire can be dangerous or fuel scarce. Cooked food expands diets by making some plants and animal tissues easier to digest. Smoke can help preserve meat or repel insects. Heat can transform raw materials, yet fire does not erase vulnerability. A fire cannot create water where none exists. It cannot stop a drought. It cannot make an unknown coastline safe at night. Social life may have been the greater technology. Small groups survive by cooperation, but not as perfectly harmonious units. They must manage tension, sharing, mating, childcare, injury, grief, and decisions about movement. Infants are costly to carry. Elders may slow travel yet preserve vital knowledge. Skilled hunters matter, but so do gatherers, toolmakers, fire tenders, healers, and people who understand seasonal rhythms. A group that abandons too many dependents may move faster but lose memory and care. A group that carries everyone may move more slowly but preserve the social fabric that makes survival human rather than merely biological. There is a lesser-known kind of danger here, the danger of being too few to remain socially whole. In very small populations, marriage partners may be limited. Alliances with neighboring groups become crucial. Exchange is not merely economic, it is demographic. People may move between bands. Partners may be found through seasonal meetings, and information may pass along with gifts, tools, food, or pigments. If a migrating group becomes cut off, its biological and cultural future narrows. The bottleneck is not only in genes, it is in relationships. As they move farther east, landscapes change again. The route through southern Asia may have included river valleys, monsoon forests, open woodlands, coastal plains, and dry zones. The Indian subcontinent with its varied environments becomes a major arena in the story. Toba ash falls across parts of this broad region, but evidence suggests that people continued to occupy some landscapes before and after the eruption. That continuity is important, though not simple. It implies resilience, but it does not prove that every local group survived unchanged. Human presence can continue while particular lineages disappear, merge, or are replaced. Along the way, the migrants likely encounter animals unlike those of Africa. Some are familiar in broad form deer-like prey, wild cattle, pigs, birds, reptiles, fish. Others require new caution. Different predators, different venomous animals, different seasonal behaviors, different diseases. The people moving into Asia are not helpless. They are flexible foragers with inherited knowledge of how to learn landscapes. But learning takes time, and time is costly when hunger is close. A mistake in identifying food or reading animal behavior can kill quickly. A group that survives is one that learns fast enough and transmits that learning reliably. The land also contains other humans. This cannot be forgotten. Homo sapiens moving beyond Africa are not entering an empty wilderness. Neanderthals are present across parts of Western and Central Eurasia. Denisovans or populations related to them occupy regions of Asia, though their exact range remains one of the great mysteries. Other archaic human groups may exist in species where fossils are rare and DNA preservation poor. The newcomers may not immediately meet them everywhere, but eventually their paths cross. Some meetings result in interbreeding because traces remain in living genomes. Others may have involved competition, avoidance, exchange, or simple parallel existence. The evidence is powerful in genetics but thin in live detail. For the migrating Homo sapiens, meeting another humankind would not have felt like entering a scientific category. They would have seen bodies, faces, gestures, tools, fires, perhaps ornaments, perhaps unfamiliar sounds. They may have recognized intelligence and danger. They may have recognized kinship of a broad kind, or only strangeness. The encounters ahead will reshape the story. But in this phase, the mere possibility of other humans adds another layer to uncertainty. A water source may already be occupied. A cave may have older claimants. A region may offer food, but not peace. Still, the migration continues because the world also rewards movement. New coasts offer shellfish. River valleys offer fish, plants, and animals. Exposed continental shelves during low sea levels create broad landscapes that later disappear beneath water. In some places, humans may find ecological opportunities with less competition from their own species. A small population, once established in a rich corridor, can grow. Children survive, groups split, knowledge of the new land deepens. What began as risk becomes homeland for the next generation. This transformation from unknown land to homeland is one of the quiet miracles of the migration. The first generation may move carefully through uncertainty, but their children grow up knowing the local river bends, nesting cliffs, stone sources, tides, and seasonal winds. Their grandchildren may speak of the older homeland only through stories, if at all. The map of belonging shifts. Africa remains in their bodies, their ancestry, their inherited capacities. But the lived world becomes Arabia, India, a drowned coast, a tropical forest edge, a highland valley, a shore facing islands beyond sight. Human identity has always been local before it is global. Yet the farther they spread, the more the line thins. A group at the leading edge may be separated by great distances from larger populations behind it. If it fails, there may be no rescue. If it succeeds, it becomes the source of further expansion. Founder effects intensify. Chance chooses which genes travel onward. Chance may also choose which myths, tool habits, ornaments, and food traditions continue, though these leave far fainter traces. The future of entire regions may depend on a few such edge populations. The archaeological record from this phase remains frustrating because preservation is uneven. Caves protect deposits, but many migrating groups may have lived in open-air settings. Coastlines drown. Tropical forests destroy bone and organic material. Later erosion removes traces. Stone tools may survive without human bones, and human bones may appear without enough cultural context. Dating methods improve, but uncertainties remain. Scholars can outline movement, but the human texture must be inferred carefully. The danger is to make the story too confident. The evidence supports migration, adaptation, and survival. But many details remain debated. What survives most clearly is the pattern of astonishing persistence. Humans keep appearing farther from Africa, not everywhere at once, not in a simple wave, and not without loss, but steadily enough that the map begins to change. A species once rooted in African landscapes becomes a presence across southern Asia. It learns new foods, new weather, new dangers. It carries fire through unfamiliar nights. It leaves flakes of stone near rivers and ancient lakes. It follows shorelines now drowned beneath modern seas. It meets other humans whose ancestors left Africa long before. It is still small, still vulnerable, still one bad sequence of events away from local disappearance. But it is moving, and with movement comes a strange kind of inheritance. The people who press onward do not know they are narrowing the ancestry of future continents. They do not know that geneticists tens of thousands of years later will look back and see reduced diversity outside Africa, traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan mixture, and signs of ancient founder events. They do not know that their camps may vanish under oceans or deserts. They know only the immediate world, a child's fever, a good tide, fresh tracks near mud, the shape of a storm, the relief of finding water where the land had seemed empty. Leaving Africa, then, is not a single heroic departure. It is a long apprenticeship in uncertainty. It is the testing of inherited African flexibility against landscapes that refuse to stay stable. It is the beginning of a journey in which success and failure may look almost identical in the moment a group moves on. Another stays. One lineage continues. Another fades. The ancient migration nearly wipes us out. Not in one dramatic scene, but through repeated narrow passages where survival depends on timing, numbers, knowledge, and luck. Ahead, one of the most important of those passages may not lie through deserts or mountains at all, but along the edges of the sea, where food is abundant, evidence is fragile, and the old human road may now be hidden beneath waves. The sea remembers poorly, or perhaps it remembers too well, and keeps its evidence out of reach along the southern edge of Asia, where ancient humans may have moved eastward in small, persistent bands. Much of the old shoreline is gone from sight. It has not vanished in the way a mythic island vanishes. It is still there in a geological sense, buried under water, sediment, coral, mud, and time. During colder periods of the Ice Age, when enormous volumes of water were locked inside glaciers, sea levels dropped and continental shelves stood exposed as broad coastal plains. What is now seabed may once have been walking ground. What is now a fishing zone may once have held camps, hearths, shell piles, stone tools, children's footprints, and paths between fresh water and tide pools. This is one of the great difficulties in tracing the migration that nearly wiped us out. If early Homo sapiens followed the coast, then the best evidence may be precisely where archaeologists have the hardest time reaching it. A land route through dry interior regions can leave tools on ancient lake margins or in caves. A coastal route can be erased by rising seas. After the last ice age, as glaciers melted and oceans rose, shorelines shifted landward. Camps that once lay safely above the tide became submerged. Shellmittens were broken by waves. Soft sediments were reworked. Organic remains decayed. Entire landscapes disappeared from human memory, except through distant echoes in genetics and scattered inland finds. The coastal migration hypothesis begins with a practical idea. Shorelines can be corridors. For mobile foragers, a coast offers a line to follow, a chain of resources, and a navigational edge between land and sea. Shellfish can often be collected with relatively simple tools. Fish may be trapped in tidal pools or shallow waters. Birds, eggs, turtles, crabs, seaweed, and coastal plants can supplement diet. Fresh water may be found at river mouths, springs, wetlands, or places where seasonal streams meet the sea. A group moving along such an edge does not need to cross every inland desert or forest. It can travel from one coastal pocket to the next, learning as it goes. But the coast is not an easy paradise. It is dangerous, variable, and sometimes deceptive. A rich sheld can be seasonal. A storm can destroy a camp overnight. Fresh water can be scarce along arid coasts. Tides can trap the unwary. Reefs can cut feet and hands. Marine foods can poison if gathered at the wrong time or from the wrong place. A shoreline backed by desert may offer food but little fuel. A shoreline backed by dense forest may make inland movement difficult. Scholars still debate how important coastal travel was compared with inland corridors, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet, the idea persists because it solves some problems while creating new ones, which is often how real prehistory works. In southern Africa, evidence shows that humans were using coastal resources far back in time. At sites such as Pinnacle Point, people exploited shellfish and other marine foods during periods when inland environments could be harsh. They also used pigments and sophisticated stone technologies. This does not prove that the same groups later followed the Indian Ocean all the way east, but it shows that Homo sapiens had the capacity to understand coastal worlds deeply. The sea was not merely a barrier, it could be a pantry, a road, a danger, and a teacher. The surprising detail is that coastal life may have helped support brain-hungry bodies in ways inland scarcity could not always match. Marine foods can provide fats and nutrients valuable to human diets, though researchers differ over how central this was to human evolution. What matters for migration is not a simple claim that seafood made humans modern, but the more grounded point that shorelines can offer predictable resources when other landscapes fail. A group that knows how to read tides has a kind of clock. A group that knows which shellfish cling to rocks after the waterfalls has a kind of stored knowledge written into the rhythm of the moon. Such knowledge can reduce risk, and reduced risk matters intensely when numbers are small. If the ancestors of later non-Africans moved along a southern coastal route, they may have passed through landscapes now transformed beyond recognition. The Red Sea margins, southern Arabia, the Persian Gulf basin when exposed, the coasts of India, Sri Lanka's shifting connection to the mainland, the shores of Southeast Asia, and eventually the drowned continent-like shelf of Sunderland. During low sea levels, islands and mainlands were arranged differently. Rivers flowed across exposed plains that are now underwater. Mangroves, reefs, estuaries, and deltas formed in places modern maps do not show as land. The migration may have followed a vanished geography. Sunderland is especially important. Today, Southeast Asia is divided by seas into peninsulas and islands. But during lower sea levels, much of the region formed a vast connected landmass linking mainland Southeast Asia with Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and surrounding shelves. This was not a simple open plain. It included rivers, forests, wetlands, coastlines, and ecological zones that shifted over time. For humans moving east, Sunderland could have been both refuge and maze. It offered land connections that no longer exist, but it also placed people near deep water channels that could not be crossed on foot. Beyond it lay Wallacea, a world of islands separated by sea even when oceans were low. And beyond that Sahul, the combined Ice Age land mass of Australia and New Guinea. The coast therefore leads toward one of the greatest thresholds in human history, the movement into Australia. But before that crossing becomes possible, people must already be comfortable with shores, tides, perhaps rafts, or simple watercraft, and the idea of moving toward land not always reachable by walking. The evidence for early boats rarely survives because wood, reeds, bark, and fiber decay. Yet the presence of humans in Sahul by at least tens of thousands of years ago proves that some kind of water crossing occurred. The shoreline hypothesis does not only explain food, it may explain a growing familiarity with the sea as a space to be used, not merely feared. Still, caution is necessary. A coastline route cannot be proven simply by pointing to later arrival in Australia. Humans may have used mixed strategies. Coastal travel in some regions, inland river corridors in others, pauses near lakes, detours through greener interiors. The idea of one continuous beach road from Africa to Australia is too neat. The ancient world was rougher than that. Monsoons, cliffs, mangrove swamps, deserts, river mouths, storms, and existing human populations would have broken any simple route. What survives in the record suggests flexibility rather than strict adherence to one path. The missing coastal evidence has pushed researchers to look in indirect ways. They study ancient sea levels to reconstruct vanished shores. They examine inland sites near old coastlines that may once have been closer to the sea. They analyze shells, fish bones, stone tools, and pigments where preservation allows. They compare genetic patterns among living and ancient populations. They search underwater landscapes, though this work is difficult, expensive, and often limited by sediment and visibility. The sea keeps its archive closed most of the time, but not entirely. Sometimes a submerged landscape yields a tool, a structure, a peat layer, a drowned forest, or a clue that the old coast was once human ground. For the migrating groups, the sea may have offered continuity during climatic uncertainty. Inland deserts could expand, but the coastline remained a line, though not always a generous one. During low sea levels, the coast moved outward, and people following it would have moved with it across generations. When seas later rose, they would retreat or shift inland. This constant adjustment may have created populations highly skilled at environmental change. Yet, it also means their camps were repeatedly placed in zones likely to be destroyed or submerged. The better the coast was for living, the worse it may be for preservation. There is a quiet irony in this. Some of the most important human journeys may have left the least visible evidence because they were successful in exactly the wrong places for archaeology. A cave in a dry region can preserve a moment for tens of thousands of years. A rich estuary can feed generations and then disappear under the sea. The archaeological record is not a neutral witness. It favors stone, caves, deserts, and accidents of burial. It forgets baskets, boats, songs, footprints in wet sand, and camps too close to ancient tides. This matters because the story of near extinction depends on what we cannot see as much as what we can. If the migrating population survived along coasts, then our evidence of their numbers, diets, routes, and failures is probably badly distorted. We may be looking at inland fragments of a largely coastal story. We may overestimate the importance of some sites simply because they survived. We may underestimate the number of failed coastal branches because they were drowned without trace. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a flaw to be brushed aside. It is part of the mystery. For a small group on an ancient shore, life might be rich but tense. At dawn, the tide exposes rocks slick with shellfish. Children and elders gather food while others search for fresh water or watch for predators. Smoke rises from a sheltered place above the beach. Stone tools are repaired with material carried from an inland outcrop. A storm line of debris marks where the sea reached during rough weather, warning them not to sleep too low. Offshore birds wheel over fish inland. The land may be dry, forested, or unknown. The group lives between two worlds, using both, fully safe in neither. The coast also encourages memory over distance. A shoreline can be followed, but good places along it must be remembered. A spring behind dunes, a reef that traps fish, a cave above storm surge, a river mouth where animals come to drink, a patch of stone suitable for tools. Such knowledge can pass down generations and outward through social networks. When groups meet, they may exchange not only mates or objects, but route information. A band that knows the next reliable water source holds knowledge as valuable as any tool. In a low-number migration, information may be the difference between expansion and disappearance. There may also be moments when the coast forced contact. A narrow habitable strip between sea and desert can concentrate people and animals. If several groups depend on the same freshwater spring or shellfish-rich bay, they cannot avoid one another forever. Such meetings could bring conflict, cooperation, exchange, or intermarriage. They could spread innovations quickly. They could also spread disease or violence. No single explanation fully accounts for how early Homo sapiens maintained enough connection during expansion. But coastal corridors may have served as threads linking small populations across long distances. As humans move farther east, the coastline becomes increasingly complex. The Indian Ocean rim is not one environment. It includes arid shores, tropical coasts, river deltas, monsoon forests, rocky headlands, and island chains. Seasonal winds shape travel and resources. Rivers bring fresh water and sediment. Reefs create rich marine habitats. Mangroves offer food, but can be hard to move through. Each region requires new learning. The migrants are not simply repeating one coastal lifestyle. They're adapting again and again to local versions of the sea. This repeated adaptation may help explain how small groups survived without large numbers. A broad diet buffers failure. If inland hunting is poor, shellfish may help. If shellfish are scarce, fish, birds, plants, or stranded marine animals may supplement food. If one bay fails, another may be reachable. Flexibility, once again, is the human advantage, but it remains fragile. A coastline with no fresh water can kill. A storm season can trap. A disease can spread through gathered groups. A hostile encounter at a crucial resource point can end a line. The sea gives, but it does not promise. By following the coast, humans may have moved through the world quickly enough to leave genetic traces of a rapid expansion. Some models suggest that the dispersal along southern Asia could have happened over a relatively short span in evolutionary terms, but rapid in such models can still mean thousands of years, a duration longer than most civilizations. For the people living it, there is no rush across the planet. There are births, deaths, camps, seasons, losses, and familiar places that only later become stepping stones in a continental story. The coastline hypothesis remains compelling because it fits the paradox of the migration. How could small, vulnerable groups travel so far through unfamiliar lands and still survive? The answer may be that they did not cross the hardest interiors first. They followed edges, exploited reliable foods, moved during favorable climate windows, and carried a flexible African inheritance into new coastal worlds. But the same hypothesis also deepens the mystery. Because, if it is right, much of the proof has drowned. The path that saved them may have erased itself. Behind the modern surf, beneath shipping lanes and coral reefs, there may be old camps from the narrow passage of human survival. A scatter of stones, a hearth, a pile of shells cracked by hands, a place where someone sat above a vanished tide and shaped a tool while children searched the rocks below. Most of these places may never be found. Yet the people who lived there may have carried the migration forward when inland routes failed, when ash darkened skies, when deserts tightened, when numbers were low enough for chance to rule. The sea, then, is not a side road in the story. It is one of the great hidden archives of our survival. It may have fed the migrants, guided them, separated them, drowned their traces, and prepared them for crossings more astonishing than anything before. Along its edges, Homo sapiens learned that the world was larger than the land underfoot, and somewhere along those shifting shores, the human road bent toward encounters that would change the species forever. Because the people moving east were not alone. Other humans already lived beyond the old African horizon, and their ghosts still travel inside us. The wider world is already inhabited. That is the fact that changes the migration from a story of empty landscapes into something stranger and more intimate. Homo sapiens moves beyond Africa, carrying its own ancient inheritance. But beyond the familiar horizons, there are other human beings whose ancestors left the continent long before. They have their own bodies shaped by cold, altitude, forest, distance, and time. They know their own rivers, caves, hunting grounds, stone sources, and seasonal refuse. They have survived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. The newcomers are not entering a silent world. They're entering a human one. In Western Eurasia, the most familiar of these other humans and Neanderthals. For generations, they were imagined as crude figures, heavy and doomed, standing in the shadow of modern humanity. That old image has not survived serious evidence. Neanderthals were strong, skilled, and deeply adapted to the climates they inhabited. They made tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, used shelters, cared for injured members of their groups, and likely understood their landscapes with a precision modern people can barely imagine. Their bodies were different from ours, more robust, with broad chests, powerful limbs, large noses, and skulls shaped in ways that speak of a long separate history. But difference is not inferiority, it is adaptation. Farther east, the picture becomes more mysterious. Denisven were identified not first through a complete skeleton, but through DNA extracted from a tiny fingerbone found in Denisa Cave in Siberia, along with a few teeth and fragments. From those remains, an entire lost human population emerged in scientific view. Their genetic traces appear today in parts of Asia and Oceania, especially among some populations of Melanesia and Aboriginal Australians. Though the Denis world itself remains poorly mapped, they may have ranged widely across Asia. They may have included deeply separated groups that were as diverse from one another as they were from Neanderthals. The evidence remains incomplete, but the genetic signal is unmistakable. Homo sapiens met them, and some of those meetings produced children. There may also have been other human populations whose names are still uncertain or whose traces are only hinted at in DNA. Asia, especially tropical and subtropical Asia, is difficult territory for ancient bone preservation. Heat, humidity, acidic soils, and time can destroy the evidence that colder caves preserve. Fossils from places such as China and Southeast Asia complicate the picture, suggesting a world of human diversity not yet fully understood. Some lineages may have persisted in refugees for long periods. Some may have vanished before modern humans arrived. Others may have met Homo sapiens and left no detectable genetic legacy, or a legacy so faint that it remains difficult to identify. What survives in the record suggests that the human family tree was less like a tree and more like a braided river with channels splitting, rejoining, and disappearing underground. For the migrating Homo sapiens, an encounter with another human group would not have come with labels. No one saw a Neanderthal and thought of taxonomy. They saw beings who looked both familiar and strange. They may have heard vocal sounds, watched gestures, noticed tools, smelled smoke, seen footprints, or found a recently used shelter. They may have approached cautiously or avoided contact. They may have fought. They may have exchanged materials, knowledge, or mates. They may have watched each other from ridges and riverbanks for days before any direct meeting. The lived reality is gone, and scholars still debate how frequent, friendly, hostile, or complex these interactions were. The genetic evidence proves that at least some contact was intimate. Most people outside Africa today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations also carry Denisovan ancestry. These not traces of mythic hybrids in the sensational sense. They are the normal biological result of populations meeting after long separation and still being close enough to have fertile descendants. The children of such unions became part of later human communities. Some inherited gene variants that were harmful and later reduced by natural selection. Others carried variants that may have helped with immunity, skin, metabolism, or adaptation to specific environments. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, but admixture is no longer speculation. It is written into living bodies. This changes the meaning of survival. The migration did not simply replace all other humans without contact. It absorbed pieces of them. The last surviving human species is not pure in the old simplistic sense. It is a survivor carrying fragments of vanished relatives. A person living today may have no Neanderthal bones in a museum, no Denisovan cave in their ancestry as a remembered place, and yet still carry small inherited sequences from those meetings tens of thousands of years ago. The vanished are not entirely vanished. Some of them persist as traces within us, but contact also brings risk. Other humans can be allies, sources of mates, guides to new landscapes, and carriers of useful knowledge. They can also be competitors to water, caves, prey, stone, and safe passages. When populations are small, even limited conflict can matter. A single violent encounter near a critical resource might end a family line. A disease carried by one group may affect another with little resistance. A region already occupied by Neanderthals or Denisovans may not offer easy settlement to newcomers. The migration that nearly wiped us out may have passed not only through deserts and climate shocks, but through territories where other human beings already knew how to survive. The meeting with Neanderthals is often imagined in Europe, but some of the earliest interbreeding likely occurred before modern humans spread deeply into Europe. Perhaps in the Near East or Western Asia, where ranges overlapped, the Levant becomes important again, not just as a corridor out of Africa, but as a zone of contact. It had seen earlier Homo sapiens, later Neanderthals, and eventually modern human populations that contributed to broader dispersals. In such borderlands, climate could shift which population held advantage. During some periods, habitats favored Neanderthals. During others, Homo sapiens may have expanded. The region was less a gateway opened once than a meeting ground repeatedly rearranged by climate. The Denisov story is even more haunting because so much of it is missing. Their DNA appears far from the Siberian cave where they were first identified. Some people in Oceania carry Denisovan ancestry at levels much higher than most mainland Eurasian populations, suggesting that ancestors of these groups encountered Denisovan-related populations somewhere along the route into Southeast Asia or near the path towards Sahul. Yet the fossils are scarce. The people themselves remain almost faceless. A few bones, a tooth, a genome, and suddenly a lost humanity stands behind the curtain. The evidence is powerful, but it feels like seeing lightning reveal a mountain range for only a second. One surprising detail is that Denis ancestry contributed to high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans through a gene variant associated with living in low-oxygen environments. This does not mean Denis was simply mountain people everywhere, but it shows that interbreeding with archaic humans sometimes gave Homo sapiens useful tools already shaped by older adaptation. In other words, the migrants did not survive the wider world only by replacing its inhabitants. In some cases, they survived by inheriting from them. Evolution can be ruthless, but it is also opportunistic. A useful variant can pass from a vanished population into a surviving one and continue long after the original people are gone. Neanderthal ancestry tells a similarly complex story. Some inherited variants may have influenced immune responses, helping modern humans confront pathogens outside Africa. Others may have affected skin and hair biology, metabolism, or responses to cold and sunlight. But not every inherited sequence was helpful. Over time, selection removed many Neanderthal variants from parts of the modern human genome, especially regions where they may have reduced fertility or caused disadvantage. The legacy is uneven. Some fragments preserved, others erased. This unevenness suggests that a mixture was real, but also biologically complicated. The human body became a testing ground for ancient encounters. For the people living through those encounters, none of this was visible. They did not know they were exchanging alleles. They knew attraction, fear, curiosity, hunger, perhaps hostility, perhaps kinship. A child born between groups would belong to someone's camp, someone's fire, someone's route through the world. That child might carry physical traits noticed by others, or might blend in with little comment. Their descendants might move east, west, north, or vanish. The intimacy of genetics can make deep time feel strangely close. The grand words of mixture and introgression refer at their origin to human bodies and human lives. Encounters may also have shaped culture, though this is far harder to prove. Did Homo sapiens learn anything from Neanderthals about local landscapes? Did Neanderthals adopt some tools or ornaments from Homo sapiens? Did ideas move between groups the way genes did? Archaeologists debate these questions intensely. Similar artifacts can emerge through independent invention, imitation, exchange, or shared ancestry. Some late Neanderthal sites show signs of symbolic behavior, pigment use, ornaments, or complex technologies, but interpretation remains contested. It is possible that contact stimulated changes in both directions. It is also possible that researchers sometimes see influence where the evidence is too thin. The safe answer is that the human world of the late Pleistocene was interactive, but the exact texture of that interaction remains uncertain. The existence of other humans also complicates the idea that Homo sapiens was always destined to win. Neanderthals had survived glacial cycles. Denisovans had adapted across unknown Asian environments. These populations were not failed drafts waiting to be replaced. They were successful for long periods. Their disappearance likely involved multiple causes: climate instability, small population sizes, competition, assimilation, disease, ecological shifts, and perhaps the demographic advantages of expanding Homo sapiens networks. No single explanation fully accounts for their extinction. The end of the other humans was not one event, and it did not happen everywhere at once. For Homo sapiens, the advantage may have been partly demographic. Even if individual Neanderthals were highly capable, their populations may have been smaller and more fragmented. Modern humans may have maintained wider social networks, allowing exchange of mates, materials, and information across larger distances. Such networks can buffer hardship. They can preserve innovations and prevent local collapse. But this advantage would not be absolute at the beginning. The migrating groups beyond Africa were also small, also vulnerable, also subject to chance. They were entering a world where the older inhabitants knew local conditions better. Survival was not guaranteed. There is a poignant reversal here. The populations we now call archaic were in many places the established ones. Homo sapiens were the newcomers, the uncertain migrants, the people pushing into landscapes already claimed by older forms of humanity. If the migration nearly failed, Part of the reason may have been that the world beyond Africa had its own human ecology. Every good cave, every reliable spring, every hunting corridor might already fit into someone else's seasonal round. Newcomers had to find openings, negotiate contact, or move into marginal zones. Expansion may have depended not only on intelligence, but on finding space in a crowded human world. The genetic ghost of these meetings follows the migrants as they spread. A small amount of Neanderthal ancestry enters the non-African lineage early and travels widely. Denisovan ancestry enters some eastern branches and becomes especially important in populations moving toward Oceania. Other ghost lineages may appear as faint statistical signals, suggesting interbreeding with archaic groups not yet identified from fossils. The human genome becomes a map of encounters, but a difficult one. It records contact without preserving the faces, languages, or stories of those who met. As the migration continues, Homo sapiens carries not only African inheritance but Eurasian additions. The line is no longer simply out of Africa. It is out of Africa through contact, through mixture, through risk. This does not weaken the African origin of modern humans. It enriches the story. The main ancestry comes from Homo sapiens, shaped in Africa, but the wider world contributes fragments from older human populations. The last human species becomes, in a small but real way, a living archive of the humans it outlasted. And still most of those other humans disappear. Neanderthal fires go cold. Denisovan populations fade from the visible record. Other possible lineages leave only hints. The newcomers survive but not untouched. The migration that nearly wiped us out passes through the bodies of others, absorbing traces even as entire populations vanish. It is one of the strangest legacies of prehistory. We are alone now, but we were not always alone, and our solitude is filled with remnants ahead. The evidence for this becomes even more intricate. Bones and tools tell one part of the story, but DNA tells another, often stranger one. It reveals lost branches, hidden meetings, founder events, vanished populations, and the narrowness of the line that continues. The ancient migration is no longer only a trail across land and coast. It becomes a ghost trail inside the genome where the dead leave fragments and the survivors carry more history than they know. The bones are few, the camps are scattered, and the coastlines have drowned. But the body keeps a different kind of archive. It does not preserve scenes. It does not remember the smell of ash, the direction of a vanished river, or the face of a stranger seen across a valley. It preserves inheritance in the long molecules passed from parent to child, generation after generation. The ancient migration leaves a trail more delicate than a stone, and in some ways more revealing. DNA cannot tell the whole story, but it can expose patterns that archaeology alone would never see. Bottlenecks, mixtures, separations, expansions, and ghost populations whose bones have not yet been found. The first great clue is diversity. Human genetic diversity is deepest within Africa because African populations carry the longest and most complex history of Homo sapiens. Outside Africa, diversity is generally reduced. This does not mean non-African populations are lesser or simpler. It means they descend largely from a smaller subset of the wider African variation. A small number of ancestors left or a larger movement narrowed through repeated filters, and later populations inherited only part of what existed in the homeland. In this reduced diversity, the migration's danger is still visible. The future outside Africa did not begin with multitudes. It began with a limited sample. Geneticists call this a founder effect, when a new population is established by a small group from a larger one. The effect is simple in principle but profound in consequence. If a few people carry certain variants and not others, their descendants will reflect that accident. Some rare variants may become common. Some once common variants may be missing over time as the group grows and spreads. The original narrowing remains hidden in the pattern of inheritance. It is as if a vast library were copied by people who could carry only a few books through a storm. Later generations may build new libraries from those books, but the missing volumes are still gone. Mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome gave early researchers some of the first genetic windows into this past, tracing maternal and paternal lines back through time. Later, Whole genome studies made the picture richer and more complicated. They showed that the ancestry of living humans is not a single clean branch, but a web of splits, mixtures, and returns. Some populations moved out of Africa. Some moved back into Africa later. Some mixed with archaic humans. Some remained isolated for long periods. Some expanded rapidly after surviving earlier restrictions. Scholars still debate the exact timing of different events, but the broad signal remains the non-African expansion passed through a narrow demographic gate. The gate was not necessarily one single campsite or one tiny band. It may have been a longer period of reduced numbers, perhaps across several related populations moving through Africa's edge, Arabia or Western Asia. The evidence remains incomplete, and genetic dates depend on assumptions about mutation rates, generation times, population structure, and later mixing. But the narrowing is real enough to shape every later history beyond Africa. The people moving through that gate carried only part of humanity's older variation, and from that part, much of the world would be repopulated. Then the ghost trail becomes stranger. Most people outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry, usually a small percentage, but spread widely across the genome in fragments. This shows that after Homo sapiens left Africa, or during the early stages of leaving, they mixed with Neanderthals. The contact was not a marginal curiosity. It became part of the ancestry of billions. The fragments are not evenly distributed. Some regions of the genome retain more archaic ancestry. Others retain very little, likely because certain inherited variants were harmful and were removed over time. Natural selection has edited the record, but it did not erase it. Denisovan ancestry adds another layer. It is not distributed in the same way as Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations in Oceania, including many indigenous peoples of New Guinea and Australia, carry significant Denisovan-related ancestry compared with most other populations. Some Asian populations carry smaller amounts. This pattern suggests that ancestors of these groups encountered Denisovan or Denisovan-related populations somewhere along the route eastward, perhaps in Southeast Asia or nearby regions, though the exact place remains debated. The bones are scarce, but the DNA points to meetings that archaeology has barely begun to locate. The lesser-known detail is that Denisovan ancestry does not appear to come from one simple source. Genetic studies suggest that different Denisovan-related populations may have contributed to different modern groups. In other words, Denisovan may be a convenient name for a broad and diverse set of archaic humans spread across parts of Asia, not one uniform people. If true, then Homo sapiens did not meet a single lost population, but several related branches of an older human world. Some were separated from one another for vast periods. Some left more ancestry than others. Some may have vanished without leaving any detectable trace in living people. There are also hints of ghost lineages within Africa and beyond it. Populations known not from named fossils, but from patterns in DNA that do not fit simple models. These signals are difficult to interpret and often debated. But they suggest that human prehistory includes more mixture than the fossil record alone reveals. In Africa, ancient population structure was likely deep and complex. Some groups may have contributed ancestry to later Homo sapiens after long separation. Beyond Africa, unknown archaic populations may have mixed with modern humans or with Denisovan and Neanderthals before those genes later entered us. The genome is not a straight road. It is a palimpsest written over but not completely erased. This genetic evidence changes how the ancient migration feels. It is no longer only a question of where people walked. It is a question of who survived inside whom. A vanished group may leave no tools that can be confidently assigned to it, no skull complete enough to name, no burial that survives, yet still persist as fragments of DNA in living populations. Another group may leave beautiful tools and no descendants. Archaeology and genetics do not always illuminate the same people. One preserves activity, the other preserves ancestry. Between them is a gap where many human lives disappear. The genetic ghost trail also reveals the cruelty of founder effects. A group at the edge of expansion can grow rapidly after a bottleneck, making its descendants numerous, while neighboring groups with equally long histories vanish from ancestry. This does not mean the surviving group was destined to dominate. It may have been better placed when climate shifted, more connected to other groups, slightly larger or simply lucky. In small populations, chance can become historical force. A few births, deaths, meetings, or separations can echo for tens of thousands of years. Ancient DNA has made this picture more vivid, but it comes with limitations. DNA survives best in cold, dry, stable conditions. That means Europe and parts of Northern Asia are overrepresented compared with tropical regions, where preservation is poor. Many of the places most important to the southern migration, including coastal Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and drowned sun landscapes, preserve ancient DNA badly or not at all. This creates a distorted spotlight. We can see certain caves and cold regions with startling clarity. While whole tropical worlds remain dim, the evidence remains incomplete. Not because nothing happened there, but because time was less kind to the molecules. When ancient genomes are recovered, they often complicate the story rather than simplify it. Populations once assumed to be direct ancestors may turn out to be side branches. Migrations once thought singular may involve multiple pulses. Groups may replace, mix with, or bypass others. Later movements can obscure earlier ones. The ancestry of living people is not a museum display preserving every ancient population in place. It is a living current constantly reshaped. To read it backward requires caution. Still, certain broad patterns stand firm. The ancestors of non-African peoples pass through a bottleneck. They mix with Neanderthals. Some eastern branches mix with Denisovan-related populations. They spread across southern Asia and beyond. Later populations branch, isolate, reunite, and expand. The ancient migration nearly fails not because one gene says so, but because the whole pattern points to narrowness, risk, and survival through small numbers. The genetic record is not dramatic in tone, but its implications are dramatic enough. Much of a later human history rests on a thin inheritance. There is something haunting about the fact that every living person is both evidence and outcome. The migration is not locked away in museums. It is present in immune responses, inherited variants, deep ancestry, and the distribution of human diversity. A person walking through a modern city carries molecular traces of ancient African populations, founder events beyond Africa, archaic encounters, and later migrations layered over them. The body is not a pure relic of one moment. It is a crowded archive, but an archive is not the same as a memory. DNA does not tell us what people feared, loved, or believed. It does not reveal whether the first meeting with Neanderthals was cautious or violent, whether a coastal group sang while gathering shellfish, whether an elder warned children about ash in the water, whether a small band knew it was running out of marriage partners, whether a lost lineage ended in hunger, disease, conflict, or absorption. Genetics can show that a population shrank. It cannot mourn the individuals. That work belongs to imagination, disciplined by evidence. The ghost trail also warns against simple identity stories. Modern populations are not unchanged descendants of single ancient groups. Everyone's ancestry is layered. Africa itself contains the deepest branching lineages and later mixtures. Non-African populations descend from out-of-Africa founders, archaic admixture, regional expansions, and countless later movements. The ancient migration is foundational, but it is not the end of human history. It is one early narrowing from which many later widenings unfold, and yet the narrowing remains outside Africa. The genetic echo of reduced diversity is a reminder of how small the successful branch may have been. Even if thousands were involved over time, the effective population size was limited. A vast future passed through a restricted channel. This is the sense in which the migration nearly wiped us out, not necessarily by bringing every Homo sapiens to the edge of total extinction, but by forcing the ancestors of much of the later world through demographic filters so severe that countless other lines disappeared. The world we know is descended from survivors, but also from losses. As the genetic evidence accumulates, it makes the ancient map stranger. The route is no longer just Africa to Arabia to Asia. It is Africa to a bottleneck, to Neanderthal contact, to Denisovan contact, to ghost lineages, to founder populations,
to drowned coasts, to isolated refuges, to explosive later expansions. It is a map written not only on land, but inside chromosomes. Some paths leave stone, some leave ash, some leave nothing but a fragment of inherited sequence, passed quietly through bodies, until a scientist tens of thousands of years later notices that it does not quite belong to the expected story. The people who carried those sequences onward did not know they were preserving vanished worlds. They were surviving. They were choosing mates, raising children, moving through climates, learning new foods, avoiding danger, and burying or leaving behind their dead. Their descendants became the ancestors of regions they never imagined. Their DNA crossed mountains, seas, deserts, and ice margins long after their own names, if they had names in the way we understand them, were gone. The genetic ghost trail is therefore both evidence and elegy. It tells us that the migration succeeded because we are here to read it. It tells us that the migration nearly failed because the line that succeeded was narrow. It tells us that we were not alone because other humans live on in fragments. And it tells us that the greatest part of the story is missing because every surviving genome is surrounded by the silence of lineages that left no descendants at all ahead. That silence grows louder as the migrating populations become smaller, more isolated, and more dependent on chance, until the question is no longer simply how humans moved across the world, but how close the moving line came to vanishing before it could become the ancestry of continents. When numbers become small enough, chance stops being background noise and becomes a force of history. A large population can absorb misfortune. One bad hunt, one fever, one dangerous birth, one quarrel, one failed camp, one drowned crossing may cause grief, but not extinction. In a small group at the edge of a migration, the same events can redirect the future of the species. The ancient humans moving beyond Africa do not need to be weak for their line to be fragile. They need only be few, scattered, and far from the safety of wider networks. This is the hidden danger behind the Great Expansion. Maps make it look broad, but the leading edge may have been narrow. A band follows a coast, another moves along a river, another pauses near a lake in Arabia or South Asia. For a while, each group may seem secure. Children are born, tools are made, fires burn. Then the climate shifts, or the water fails, or contact with neighboring groups breaks. Suddenly the group is not a wave of expansion. It is an island of people surrounded not by ocean necessarily, but by distance, uncertainty, and risk. Isolation is dangerous because humans are social survivors. A group needs food and water, but it also needs partners, teachers, allies, and information. If too few people remain connected, the future tightens. Young people may have fewer possible mates. Elders may die without passing on knowledge. A specialized skill may vanish. A small injury may become fatal if the person who knows certain treatments is gone. A group may survive physically for a time, while its cultural strength thins invisibly. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were remarkably adaptable, but adaptability depends on transmission. Knowledge must move from one body to another before death interrupts it. The genetic bottleneck outside Africa is the molecular shadow of this narrowness. It tells us that the ancestors of later non-African populations carried only part of the older African diversity. But within that broad statement are many possible human dramas. Perhaps a small group became separated from related populations during a dry phase. Perhaps several groups passed through a corridor, but only one left many descendants. Perhaps disease, conflict, or famine reduced numbers repeatedly. Perhaps later expansions erased the genetic signatures of earlier travelers. Scholars still debate the exact sequence, and no single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. The important point is that the line leading onward was not wide. For people living inside that line, survival may have depended on staying connected across distance. Seasonal gatherings could have mattered as much as food. A meeting between bands might allow exchange of partners, stone, pigments, shells, stories, and root knowledge. A person marrying into another group could carry information between landscapes. A tool style could spread not through conquest, but through kinship and imitation. If such networks held, small populations could remain resilient. If they broke, each group became more vulnerable to the mathematics of disappearance. Mathematics sounds cold, but in this case, it describes something painfully concrete. In a small population, random events can change everything. If more boys than girls are born for several generations, or more girls than boys, future partnerships may be affected. If a storm kills several adults at once, skills vanish. If one family line happens to have more surviving children, its genetic variants become common for no reason other than luck. This is genetic drift, and it is strongest in small populations. It is one of the quiet engines of prehistory, less dramatic than volcanic ash, but perhaps just as powerful over time. Founder effects add another layer. A few individuals moving into a new region carry a limited set of genes and traditions. If their descendants grow, that limited set expands with them. Later abundance can hide earlier scarcity. A thriving population thousands of years later may descend from a surprisingly small number of founders. The world may fill with people whose ancestry once passed through a narrow gate, so ordinary at the time that no one noticed it. A campfire, a birth, a crossing, a decision to follow the coast instead of turning inland. Such things can become continental history. The danger was not only biological. Culture itself has population size. Complex skills survive better when many people know them, use them, and teach them in very small groups. Even useful practices can disappear by accident. A method for making composite tools, using adhesive, preparing fibers, building watercraft, or processing toxic plants may require repeated instruction. If the few experts die, the group may fall back on simpler methods, not because it is less intelligent, but because knowledge has been cut. The evidence remains incomplete, but archaeologists have seen technological traditions appear, disappear, and reappear in deep time. Some of that flickering may reflect changing needs. Some may reflect the fragility of learning in small populations. This is why a nearly failed migration does not have to look like bodies scattered across a disaster scene. It may look like thinning. Fewer people at the meeting place, fewer children surviving to adulthood, fewer neighboring camps known by name or memory, fewer hands able to make the difficult tools, fewer elders who remember the dry season route, fewer chances to recover from a mistake. Extinction for a local lineage can arrive quietly. A group dwindles, joins another, or disappears, and the land remains. Some of the ancient migrants may have lived in refugees during harsh phases. A refuge is a place where survival remains possible, while surrounding landscapes become hostile. A spring-fed valley, a coastline with reliable shellfish, a mountain zone with rainfall, a river bend, a lake margin, a forest edge. Refuges can preserve populations through drought or cold, but they can also concentrate them. When many animals and human groups depend on the same shrinking resources, competition rises. Refugees are safe only by comparison. They are not peaceful by nature. In such places, human contact could either save or destroy. Two small groups meeting near water might exchange partners and knowledge, increasing resilience for both. They might also fight over access. The outcome could depend on prior relationships, language similarity, group size, hunger, or chance. Because no written record survives, the emotional truth of these meetings is lost. But the demographic importance remains. Contact between groups can prevent isolation. Contact can also spread disease or violence. The same social world that sustains humans can endanger them. The migrations near failure may also have been shaped by children. Human children require long care. They are costly in mobile groups. Yet, they are the future of the group's knowledge and genes. A band under stress may space births more widely, whether through biology, nursing patterns, movement demands, or social practice. High infant mortality can prevent growth for generations. A population does not need mass death to remain small. It needs only births and survival to stay low. A few hard generations can leave a lasting genetic mark. There is a lesser-known vulnerability in migration. The leading edge can become a demographic trap. New land may be rich at first, encouraging a small group to move farther. But each step away from the population core can reduce contact. If the group grows, it may split again, sending even smaller branches outward. Expansion creates opportunity, while also multiplying isolation. The boldest groups may be the most likely to vanish. Their disappearance leaves no warning for the next wave, except perhaps abandoned tools or empty shelters, whose meaning no one can read. The human line that survived beyond Africa likely passed through these filters again, and again. Some branches failed in Arabia. Some may have disappeared in South Asia. Some may have been absorbed by later populations. Some may have contributed a little ancestry, then been mostly overwritten. The record is not detailed enough to name them, but the reduced diversity outside Africa, the patterns of archaic mixture, and the uneven, archaeological traces all point toward a world where survival was selective and contingent. What we call the migration may be the surviving edge of many attempted migrations, and still the survivors were not passive victims of chance. They made choices, they changed diets, they maintained fires, they repaired tools, they cared for children and injured adults, they remembered roots, they learned tides, rains, animals, and stones. They formed bonds beyond immediate family. They likely used ornaments, pigments, gestures, and shared practices to mark identity and connection. These things matter because they help explain how small populations avoided total collapse. Culture is a survival system. It turns individual knowledge into group inheritance. But culture itself needs people. That is the paradox. Humans survive by sharing knowledge. Yet knowledge can vanish when people are too few. The migration that nearly wiped us out may have succeeded only when social networks were wide, enough to keep small groups from becoming isolated fragments. A shell bead carried inland, a stone transported across distance, a shared tool style spreading between sites. Such evidence may hint at connections that were more than decorative. They may show lifelines. In this light, ancient ornaments are not trivial. A pierced shell, a pigment-stained object, or a carefully shaped item may signal identity, alliance, memory, or belonging. In a sparse world, recognizing who is friend, kin, exchange partner, or marriage ally could be essential. Symbolic behavior is often discussed as art or cognition, but it may also have had demographic power. It helped humans create social worlds larger than the people immediately visible. That wider social imagination may have been one of the things that kept the line from breaking. The danger was greatest when environments changed faster than networks could adapt. A drying corridor could separate groups that once met. Rising seas could erase familiar coastal grounds. A cold phase could push animals away from known routes. A volcanic event could disrupt food and movement. Each disruption tested not only bodies but relationships. A group with allies might shift territory. A group alone might vanish. By the time Homo sapiens begins to appear across wider parts of Asia, the migration has already passed through a gauntlet of invisible losses. The surviving groups are descendants of those who made it through climate windows, coastal hazards, encounters with other humans, and demographic narrowing. They carry fragments of Neanderthal and Denisvan ancestry. They carry a reduced but expanding genetic inheritance. They carry tools and memories shaped by instability. They are still vulnerable, but they are no longer merely leaving Africa. They are becoming at home in new worlds. The phrase "nearly wiped us out" therefore should be heard with care. It is not only a claim about one eruption or one catastrophic winter. It is the cumulative pressure of small numbers meeting a changing planet. It is the possibility that many human futures ended before one continued. It is the knowledge that our later abundance began in scarcity. The ancestors who survived were not chosen by destiny. They were filtered by climate, geography, contact, skill, and chance. Ahead, their survival will depend increasingly on ingenuity that can travel, tools that can be remade from unfamiliar stone, fire that can be carried or kindled in new environments, social knowledge that can hold groups together, and perhaps the first technologies that allow dangerous water crossings. The line remains thin, but it does not break. It bends toward new lands, toward colder zones and tropical forests, toward islands beyond sight, toward a crossing that should have been impossible for people, with so little, and yet somehow was made. Survival at the edge of the world is not built from strength alone. It is built from small inventions repeated until they become ordinary. A sharp edge where there was once a stone, a controlled flame where there was once darkness, a carrying sling, a hide wrap, a digging stick, a point fixed to a shaft, a memory tied to a landmark, a rule about sharing food before hunger becomes anger. These things do not look grand from the distance of deep time, especially when only the stone survives, but they are the machinery of endurance. The ancient migration continues because human beings carry not only bodies into new landscapes, but techniques, habits, and shared attention. A stone tool is easy to underestimate. It sits behind glass in a museum, silent and gray, stripped of the hands that made it urgent. But in the world of the migration, a good stone edge can mean meat cut quickly before scavengers arrive, hide scraped before it rots, wood shaped into a spear, roots dug from hard soil, shellfish opened, tendons separated for binding, bone worked into another tool. A flake struck from a prepared core is not a random chip. It is planning made visible. The maker must understand the stone's hidden structure, the angle of force, the sequence of removals, the difference between useful fracture and wasted effort. As Homo sapiens move through Arabia, South Asia, and beyond, stone technology has to adapt to local materials. The perfect stone is not always available. A group may know how to work fine-grained silkcrete, or obsidian-like materials, then find itself in a region where the available rock behaves differently. Tool traditions cannot be copied blindly from one landscape to another. They must be translated. What survives in the record suggests both continuity and flexibility. People carry methods with them, but they also adjust to what the land offers. This is one of the quiet signs of intelligence that does not need exaggeration. Humans survive because they can change the recipe without losing the meal. Fire is even older than Homo sapiens, but in this migration, it remains one of the great anchors of life. Around fire, food becomes safer and more digestible. Nights become less exposed. Predators hesitate. Damp bodies warm. Wood hardens. Stone can be heat-treated. Stories, instructions, warnings, and social bonds gather in the circle of light. Fire allows people to extend the day and inhabit colder or darker places with more confidence. Yet, it is not effortless. Fire must be made, guarded, fed, transported, and protected from rain in a treeless or wet environment. Fuel can become a serious concern. A group that controls fire still has to negotiate with the landscape. There is a lesser-known intimacy in ancient technology. Much of it was probably perishable. The archaeological record is biased towards stone because stone endures. But the migrating world would have been full of objects made from wood, bark, grass, sinew, hide, feathers, bone, shell, resin, and fiber. Carrying bags may have mattered as much as spear points. Cordage may have been essential for binding tools, making nets, tying shelters, carrying infants, or securing bundles. Digging sticks may have opened underground foods that stone tools only helped prepare. Simple containers could expand the distance between water sources. These things rarely survive, and because they rarely survive, they are easy to forget. But forgetting them makes ancient people poorer than they were. Adhesives may have been especially important to have to stone point onto a wooden shaft. People need binding, and often glue, made from plant resin, gum, bitumen, or other materials, sometimes mixed and heated with care. This is chemistry at a human scale. Too much heat ruins the mixture. Too little leaves it weak. The result is a composite tool stronger than its parts, requiring planning across different materials collected from different places. Such tools speak of minds that do not simply react to the present object, but imagine a future object assembled from pieces not yet joined. In hard times, diet is technology too. Knowing what can be eaten when, and how to process it, is as important as knowing how to hunt. Some plants are safe only after soaking, pounding, roasting, or leaching. Some shellfish are dangerous at certain times. Some bones must be cracked for marrow before scavengers arrive. Some seeds or tubers reward patience more than speed. A broad diet helps a group survive when preferred foods fail, and broad diets require accumulated knowledge. The evidence remains incomplete, but the repeated success of Homo sapiens in varied environments suggests an extraordinary ability to learn food landscapes quickly and pass that knowledge on. The most fragile technology may have been social learning itself. A child does not invent the world alone. A child watches hands strike stone, watches elders test plants, watches adults read clouds and animal tracks, watches when to be silent and when to call out. Skills enter the body through repetition. In a small migrating group, teaching cannot be left to chance. If children do not learn, the group's future narrows. If knowledge is hoarded too tightly, it may die with one person. If it spreads, the group becomes more resilient than any individual. Culture is survival, distributed across many minds. This helps explain why symbolic behavior matters. Pigment, ornaments, patterns, and shared rituals are often treated as signs of art or abstract thought. And they may be that, but they may also help hold together wider networks. A shell bead carried far inland is not only decoration. It may mark identity, memory, alliance, or belonging. A red ochre mark may carry meaning within a group that no archaeologist can recover. In sparse landscapes, where meeting strangers can be dangerous or life-saving, visible signs of connection may matter. Scholars still debate the meanings of early symbolic objects, and no single explanation fully accounts for them. But they likely belong to the social machinery that kept small populations from becoming isolated dust. Tools and fire do not make humans invincible. They make humans flexible. That difference matters. A spear helps only if there is prey. A net helps only if there are fish. A shell ornament helps only if others understand its meaning. Fire helps only if fuel exists. The ancient migrants survive by combining many partial solutions, none sufficient alone. Their strength is not one miracle invention. It is the layering of techniques. Stone plus wood, fire plus food knowledge, memory plus movement, kinship plus exchange, caution plus curiosity. In unfamiliar regions, innovation may have happened through necessity. A group reaches a coast where fish are trapped in tidal pools, and someone learns the rhythm. Another reaches a dry interior where underground storage organs become essential. Another enters forest margins where visibility is poor and tracking changes. Another approaches islands and must think differently about water. Each environment asks a new question. The groups that answer survive. Those that cannot may leave only a few tools or nothing at all. The nearly wiped out line continues because enough of these answers are found. The answers not always dramatic. Sometimes they are slow improvements. A better way to carry water. A sharper point. A seasonal camp placed slightly higher above floods. A habit of revisiting shell beds only after they recover. A rule about sharing meat widely enough to preserve alliances. Such practices do not look like revolutions, but over generations they decide whether children live. There is also patience in this ingenuity. Modern people often associate migration with movement, but survival may depend just as much on knowing when not to move. A good refuge should not be abandoned too soon. A dangerous crossing should wait for weather, tide, or season. A dry corridor should be entered only when signs are favorable. Ancient humans likely spent long periods learning local places before their descendants moved farther. The migration is cumulative, not because one group races across the world, but because many groups turn unknown places into known ones, then pass that knowledge forward until the edge moves again. The tools also reveal something about identity. A tool tradition can persist across distance, suggesting learning networks or shared ancestry. It can change abruptly, suggesting adaptation, replacement, or new influence. Archaeologists must be careful because similar tools do not always mean the same people and on the same day. Different tools do not always mean different populations. But technology is one of the few voices left. It tells us that ancient humans were not simply surviving biologically, they were making choices within traditions, adjusting them, sometimes preserving old ways, and sometimes abandoning them. As the migrants moved towards Southeast Asia and the island worlds beyond, their toolkit must include more than sharp stone. It must include planning across water. Even short sea crossings require some combination of observation, courage, materials, and social coordination. A raft, log float, bamboo bundle, dugout-like form, or reed craft would be nearly invisible archaeologically at these time depths. But some kind of watercraft or flotation technology becomes unavoidable before humans reach Sahul. That means the people approaching the far eastern edge of the migration are not merely walkers, they are experimenters with the boundary between land and sea. The idea is astonishing because the populations involved may still have been small. It is one thing for a large settled society to build boats with specialists and stored food. It is another for mobile foragers to organize a crossing with children, tools, fire-making capacity, and enough confidence to leave one shore for another. Yet this is what the later evidence demands. At some point, humans cross water that could not be crossed by accident alone, at least not easily enough to explain lasting settlement. The line that nearly vanished learns to move through a world broken by sea. Before that crossing, however, there is preparation hidden in ordinary coastal life. People who gather shellfish learn tides. People who fish learn currents. People who watch birds learn where land or reefs may lie. People who move along coasts learn that the sea changes but also repeats. They may not think of themselves as sailors, but they are becoming familiar with marine rhythms. The boundary that once looked like an edge becomes a medium. This is the deeper meaning of fragile ingenuity. Humans are not the strongest animals, nor the fastest, nor the most naturally armored. Their young are helpless for years. Their groups can be small. Their bodies are vulnerable to heat, cold, hunger, infection, and injury. Yet, they survive by making the world slightly more usable than it first appears. A stone becomes an edge, a branch becomes a spear, ash becomes a clue to past fire, a shell becomes food, ornament, or container, a coastline becomes a road, a stranger becomes a mate, ally, or source of knowledge. A dangerous crossing becomes possible. The evidence does not allow us to praise them with certainty beyond what is known. We should not turn them into modern geniuses wearing ancient skins, nor into primitive figures stumbling by instinct. They were humans, observant, social, fallible, inventive, constrained by hunger and landscape, capable of mistakes, capable of care. Their technologies were not simple because their minds were simple. They were elegant because they had to be portable, reapable, and teachable. As the migration continues, these portable solutions carry the survivors farther from Africa than any Homo sapiens had endured before. Behind them lie bottlenecks, ash, green corridors, dead ends, and encounters with other humankinds. Ahead lies one of the most startling proofs of their capacity, the arrival in Sahul, the ancient joined land of Australia and New Guinea. To reach it, they will have to cross water into a realm no human ancestor had ever entered. The line is still thin, the risks are enormous, but by now, the migrants have learned the oldest human lesson again and again. The world does not need to be safe for it to be survivable. Beyond the forests and coasts of Southeast Asia, the world breaks apart into islands. During the Ice Age, lower sea levels join many lands that are separate today, creating the vast region known as Sunderland, where parts of mainland Southeast Asia connect with Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and surrounding shelves. But even at the lowest seas, the route does not become a continuous road all the way to Australia and New Guinea. Deep channels remain. Water still cuts the world into pieces. Somewhere along this broken edge, ancient humans face a threshold no earlier human species is known to have crossed in the same way. To continue, they must leave one shore and trust that another exists beyond sight, haze, current, and fear. Sahul, the Ice Age landmass that joins Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania are different times of low sea level, is not connected to Asia by land. It has never been connected during the time humans existed. This fact matters enormously. Human arrival there cannot be explained by simply walking along exposed shelves. It requires water crossing. The exact route remains debated. Perhaps through island chains from Sulawesi and Tewur. Perhaps through northern routes toward New Guinea. Perhaps using paths that shifted with sea level. But no route removes the central problem. At least one stretch of open water had to be crossed by people capable of carrying themselves, children, tools, and enough knowledge to begin again. The arrival in Sahul is one of the great turning points in human history because it proves that the migrants were no longer merely following land, they were crossing between worlds. The timing is still debated, with many researchers placing human presence in Australia by at least around 50,000 years ago, while some evidence suggests dates that may be older, perhaps around 60,000 to 65,000 years ago. The evidence remains incomplete, and dating early sites is difficult. But the broad conclusion is secure. Humans reached Sahul astonishingly early. They did so while populations were still small, while the migration beyond Africa was still relatively recent in deep time terms, and while the world remained full of other human lineages that would not survive. It is tempting to imagine the first crossing as an accidental drift of storm, a broken raft, a handful of survivors washing ashore, but accidental arrival alone is hard to reconcile with lasting settlement. To establish a population, enough people must arrive, or repeated crossings must occur with women and men, children or future births, tools, social knowledge, and the ability to find food quickly. A lone castaway does not found a continent. A few starving survivors cannot easily become a thriving population unless the odds align, almost miraculously. What survives in the record suggests something more organized than pure accident, though not necessarily planned in a modern sense. It may have involved short crossings between visible islands, repeated movements, accumulated knowledge, and simple watercraft made from materials that have long vanished. Those watercraft are among the missing inventions of prehistory: wood, bamboo, bark, reeds, vines, and fibers decay. No boat from that first crossing survives. No paddle rests beside the earliest camps. Archaeology gives us the result, not the object. Humans are in Sahul. Therefore, some form of crossing happened. The tool is inferred from the achievement. This is one of the strange situations in ancient history where absence is not weakness. The evidence of arrival is the evidence of capability. The sea crossing itself becomes the artifact. Imagine the preparation without turning it into fantasy. People know coasts. They know tides. They know floating wood, perhaps bamboo, perhaps logs bound with fiber. They know that birds move toward unseen land. They may see smoke from distant fires on islands, cloud formations over land, or mountains visible from certain points in clear weather. They may not think of themselves as inventing navigation. They are extending skills already learned along shores and rivers. A crossing that looks impossible on a modern map may have been approached as a series of difficult but imaginable steps by people who had lived for generations near water. Still, the danger is enormous. The sea is not a path that keeps footprints. It moves under the body. It erases mistakes immediately. A crossing can fail because of wind, current, thirst, panic, damaged craft, or simple misjudgment. Children cannot swim indefinitely. Fire cannot be allowed to die if making it again is uncertain. Tools must be protected from loss. Food and water must last long enough. The people who attempt such movement are not reckless, or they would not survive. But they are willing to act at the edge of knowledge. When they reach Sahul, they enter a world unlike any they have known. Australia and New Guinea together contain enormous environmental variety. Tropical forests, savas, wetlands, mountains, dry interiors, coastlines, river systems, and animals found nowhere else. Giant marsupials, huge flightless birds, reptiles, and unfamiliar plants form ecosystems shaped without humans. The newcomers must learn quickly. They arrive not as conquerors with guaranteed dominance, But as foragers entering a continent of strange rules, some regions may be generous, others are lethal to ignorance. The settlement of Sahul also reveals the speed and flexibility of human adaptation.
Within thousands of years and perhaps sooner, people appear to have spread across very different Australian environments, from northern entry regions to interior and southern landscapes. This does not mean a single group walked across the continent in one heroic journey. It means descendants expanded, learned, divided, and made new homelands. They found water in dry country, read unfamiliar animal behavior, used plants requiring local knowledge, adapted to seasonal extremes, and maintained culture across immense distances. The line that once seemed nearly broken has crossed the sea and begun to root itself in a new continent. There is surprising implication here. The first Australians and New Guineans descend from some of the most daring early branches of the human expansion, and their ancestors carried Denisovan ancestry that may have entered the lineage before or during movement through eastern regions. This genetic trace links the crossing of Sahul to encounters with archaic humans somewhere in Sahul or nearby island worlds. The people entering Sahul were already a mixed archive of African origin and Eurasian contact. They were modern humans, but not untouched by the older human world they had passed through. The consequences for Sahul's animals remain debated. Many large animals in Australia disappeared sometime after human arrival, though climate change and human activity are both discussed as possible factors. Some researchers argue that hunting, landscape burning, or ecological disturbance contributed significantly. Others emphasize climatic drying and environmental stress. No single explanation fully accounts for all extinctions across time and region. What is clear is that human arrival introduced a new kind of ecological force, a flexible predator, fire user, and landscape reader capable of spreading into habitats that had never known such a creature before. Fire becomes especially important in Australia. Humans likely use burning in ways that shaped vegetation, hunting opportunities, travel routes, and resource patterns. Though the timing and intensity of early fire use are still debated, fire can clear undergrowth, encourage new plant growth, drive animals, and maintain mosaics of habitat. It can also transform landscapes over long periods. The people who arrived were not simply adapting to Sahul. Eventually, they became part of the forces shaping it. But in the beginning, fire is still first of all survival, warmth, cooking, protection, signal, and continuity. The crossing to Sahul also changes the emotional scale of the migration. Until now, the story's been one of corridors, coasts, deserts, ash, and encounters with other humans. With Sahul, the migration proves it can leap. The world is no longer a connected surface. It is a broken planet, and Homo sapiens has found a way to move across the breaks. This does not mean the population is safe. In fact, new lands can intensify founder effects. The first Sahul populations may have been small, carrying limited diversity, then expanding into enormous territory. Chance again becomes ancestry. Once in Sahul, isolation deepens. For tens of thousands of years, populations in Australia and New Guinea develop long histories, shaped by local environments and cultural continuity. Rising seas later separate Tasmania, New Guinea, and Australia more sharply. Coastlines shift. Old entry routes drown. The first landing places may now lie underwater, just like so many earlier coastal camps along the migration. The evidence of arrival is therefore fragmented. Archaeologists find early sites inland or in rock shelters, but the original coastal threshold may be gone beneath the sea. This is one reason the story retains its mystery. We know humans arrived. We know they crossed water. We know they spread. But the first moment, the beach where feet touch soil, the craft pulled above the tide, the first fire kindled in a new land, those are lost. The people who made the crossing left descendants, but not a preserved scene. The most important human actions often vanish almost completely. Only their consequences remain large enough to see. The crossing also forces us to reconsider what advance means. These were not city builders. They did not have metal, writing,
wheels, or agriculture. Yet, they achieved something that required planning, environmental knowledge, cooperation, risk assessment, and technological imagination. A society can be materially light and cognitively rich. A raft can be more historically important than a palace if it carries a nearly extinguished lineage into a new continent. The ancient migrants' tools may look simple to modernize, but their decisions were anything but. For the broader migration, Sahul becomes proof of survival after near failure. A population that had passed through bottlenecks, climate hazards, and encounters with other humans now establishes itself beyond a sea barrier. This does not erase the losses behind it. Many branches may still have vanished. Other human species still face decline, but one branch of Homo sapiens has crossed into a region no hominin had reached before, and that crossing will echo through all later history. It shows that the fragile line has gained momentum. The human presence in Sahul also widens the meaning of homeland. Africa remains the deep origin. Eurasia is the great corridor of encounters. Sahul becomes one of the earliest proofs that Homo sapiens can make belonging in a wholly new world. The descendants of those first settlers developed deep relationships with landscapes, waters, skies, animals, plants, and ancestral places over tens of thousands of years. Their histories are not side notes to the Out of Africa story. They're among its earliest and most profound continuations. Yet, even this success carries the mark of narrowness. Genetic lineages in Sahul, like those elsewhere outside Africa, reflect founder events and later isolation. Populations grow, diversify, and develop rich cultures, but they begin from limited numbers. The continent is vast. The first human thread entering it may have been thin. Later, abundance should not blind us to that. The migration nearly wiped us out because again and again the future was carried by groups small enough to disappear. In Sahul, one such group did not disappear. It crossed, endured, and became ancestral. As the story moves back westward and northward toward Europe, the contrast becomes sharp. In Sahul, Homo sapiens enters a continent without other known human species already established. In Europe, the situation is different. There, the newcomers approach cold lands, where Neanderthals have lived for ages. The challenge is no longer open water into a new world, but survival at the edge of ice, competition, and mixture with older humans, and the test of climates that can punish every weakness. The ancient migration has already achieved the impossible crossing, but another threshold waits in the cold, where the story of survival becomes entangled with the disappearance of the last close cousins humanity will ever know. Europe waits in cold light. It is not the first destination of the Great Migration, and it is not the easiest. By the time Homo sapiens becomes firmly established there, humans have already crossed deserts, coasts, forests, and seas. They have moved through southern Asia, met other human populations, and reached Sahul across water. Yet Europe holds a special gravity in the story, because it preserves so much evidence and because it is the land most closely associated with the final long encounter between modern humans and Neanderthals. Here the migration enters a world of ice margins, steppe, cave shelters, seasonal herds, and older human inhabitants who know the cold better than the newcomers do. The first modern humans entering Europe are not walking into empty wilderness. Neanderthals have lived across parts of the continent and western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They have endured glacial cycles, hunted large animals, used fire, made tools, occupied caves and open-air sites, and survived in climates that would kill the careless quickly. The newcomers bring their own strengths, flexible technologies, wide social networks, symbolic practices, perhaps faster innovation and broader exchange. But none of that guarantees immediate success. Europe is not simply a prize waiting for Homo sapiens. It is a hard threshold. The climate itself is a living opponent. Ice sheets expand across the north. South of them stretch cold steppe and tundra-like environments with herds of horse, reindeer, bison, mammoth, and other animals moving across open landscapes. Forests come and go with climatic pulses. Weather can turn quickly. Winters are long.
Fuel, shelter, clothing, and storage become matters of survival. A group that misjudges seasonality can starve in a land rich with animals, but poor in easy forgiveness. What survives in the record suggests that early modern humans adapted rapidly, but the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how many early arrivals failed before later populations became established. The entry into Europe also unfolds in waves and fragments. Fossils and tools point to early Homo sapiens' presence by around 45,000 years ago, perhaps with earlier hints in some regions. But presence does not always mean permanence. Some early groups may have entered, occupied certain areas, and then vanished or been replaced by later groups. Cold swings, volcanic events, ecological stress, and competition may all have shaped the pattern. The continent was not conquered in one movement. It was tested, abandoned in places, re-entered, and slowly transformed. One surprising detail is that some of the earliest modern human remains in Europe already show evidence of Neanderthal ancestry not far back in their family trees. This means the encounter was not an abstract population event hidden somewhere in the distant past. In some cases, it was recent enough to sit within a few generations. The line between them and us was crossed in real bodies, real families, real children. Yet those early mixed populations did not all become major ancestors of later Europeans. Some appear to be side branches, reminders that even successful arrival could end in disappearance. Europe, therefore, becomes another landscape of ghosts. There are Neanderthal ghosts certainly, but also modern human ghosts, early Homo sapiens groups, whose tools and bones appear, then fade from the main ancestry of later people. The migration that nearly wiped us out still carries its old danger here. A population can reach a new land and still fail to become the future. The continent can preserve its bones and yet not preserve its lineage. The disappearance of Neanderthals remains one of the most debated events in human evolution. For a long time, it was told too simply, as if modern humans arrived and Neanderthals immediately lost because they were inferior. The evidence does not support such a crude story. Neanderthals had survived for a very long time, and their extinction likely involved a convergence of pressures. Their populations may have been small and fragmented. Climate instability may have repeatedly damaged their habitats and prey systems. Modern humans may have competed for resources or occupied overlapping territories. Interbreeding may have absorbed some Neanderthal lineages into expanding Homo sapiens groups. Disease may have played a role. No single explanation fully accounts for their disappearance. What makes the story especially poignant is that Neanderthals vanish not as strangers but as relatives. Some of their DNA persists in most non-African people today. Their extinction was not total eraser in the genetic sense, but it was the end of them as a distinct population. Their fires went out. Their tool tradition ceased. Their seasonal rounds stopped being walked by Neanderthal bodies. The caves and valleys remained. The herds continued for a time, but one form of humanity was gone. For Homo sapiens, Europe demanded new intensities of invention. Clothing becomes critical, though direct evidence is rare. Needles appear later, with clearer preservation, but tailored coverings, hide working, and foot protection were likely important in cold environments before they archaeologically obvious. Shelter could mean caves were available, but also structures made of wood, bone, hide, and other materials now mostly lost. Fire must be maintained against cold and damp. Hunting requires coordination, planning, and knowledge of large migratory animals. The cold does not merely test endurance, it tests social organization. Food strategies shift with environment. In open Ice Age landscapes, large herbivores are crucial, but dependence on them is risky. Herds move, weather changes routes. A failed hunt in winter can be deadly. People need backup foods, storage methods, cooperation, and perhaps long-distance ties to other groups. The ability to maintain networks across large areas may have given Homo sapiens a demographic advantage. If one group suffers, others can provide mates,
information, or refuge. In a cold, unstable continent, connection may be as important as skill. Symbolic life becomes increasingly visible in Europe, partly because preservation and research history are strong there. Ornaments, pigments, carved objects, and later cave art reveal a world of meaning far beyond survival mechanics. But even here, caution is necessary. The famous painted caves belong mostly to periods after the first arrival and after Neanderthals had largely disappeared. They should not be projected backward too neatly. Still, the broader pattern suggests that modern human groups used symbols, objects, and shared traditions to bind communities across distance. In a sparse world, meaning can be infrastructure. The cold threshold also highlights the unevenness of the archaeological record. Europe is rich in caves, long studied by archaeologists, and often better suited for preserving bone and artifacts than tropical regions. This can make Europe seem more central to the human story than it was in terms of first expansion. It is central to evidence, not necessarily to origin. The Great Migration had already transformed southern Asia and Sahul before Europe's later flourishing becomes so visible. The record is bright in Europe, partly because the continent kept more of its traces. Even so, Europe gives the migration one of its clearest dramas. Two human populations overlapping near the end of one of them. Imagine the edge of a cold valley, where smoke rises from two different camps in different seasons. Perhaps not at the same time, perhaps separated by years, perhaps aware of each other through tracks, abandoned tools, or distant sightings. Neanderthals know the land deeply. Homo sapiens bring expanding networks and new combinations of tools and symbols. The animals do not care which human follows them. The winter does not care which lineage is older. The land tests all equally, and the outcome is not immediate. For thousands of years, overlap may have varied by region. In some places, Neanderthals vanish before modern humans are clearly present. In others, contact or near contact seems likely. There may have been mosaics of occupation, with one population in a valley system and another elsewhere shifting as climate changed. The idea of a single frontier line is too simple. Europe was a patchwork of refuges, corridors, cold plains, mountain barriers, and ecological zones. Human populations moved through that patchwork unevenly. The eventual success of Homo sapiens in Europe may have depended less on one superior trait than on a bundle of advantages that mattered together: larger or more connected populations, broader exchange networks, flexible technology, symbolic systems that helped maintain identity, and the ability to exploit varied resources. Neanderthals may have had some of these qualities too, but perhaps not in the same combination or demographic scale. The evidence remains debated, and any explanation that makes the outcome seem inevitable should be distrusted. Neanderthals were not doomed from the beginning. They were outlasted under specific historical pressures. For the migrating Homo sapiens, Europe is both triumph and warning. It shows that the fragile line can enter harsh northern environments and survive. But it also shows how easily human forms can vanish. Neanderthals were not animals at the edge of humanity. They were humans of another kind, long successful, adapted, intelligent, and close enough to become part of our ancestry. If they could disappear, then survival is not guaranteed by being human. It is granted temporarily by population, adaptation, luck, and circumstance. As modern humans spread deeper into Europe, the world behind them becomes layered with loss. Earlier Homo sapiens expansions outside Africa may have faded. Some coastal routes are drowned. Denisovan populations are mostly invisible except in genes. Neanderthals are nearing their end. The migration that nearly wiped us out is becoming the migration that leaves us alone. That solitude, however, is not pure victory. It is an inheritance of vanished relatives and vanished alternatives. The cold threshold of Europe therefore sharpens the central truth of the whole journey. Homo sapiens survives not because the species is untouched by danger, but because enough groups remain connected, adaptable, and fortunate through repeated crisis. The line bends but does not break. It crosses into cold lands, absorbs traces of older humans, and slowly becomes established across a continent where survival must be remade every winter.
Behind every later cave painting, every carved figure, every buried ornament, and every hearth in the European Ice Age, lies this older passage through uncertainty. And still this story is not finished. The migrants who survive Europe, Asia, Sahul, and the long corridors beyond Africa are not yet the masters of history. They are ancestors, but they do not know it. They have passed through bottlenecks and meetings, through ash and cold, through sea crossings and dead-end corridors. The survivors are few compared with the multitudes to come, but they carry the future forward. From them, later populations will grow, split, wander, settle, and transform the planet in ways no Ice Age forager could imagine. The line that almost vanished is about to become the root of worlds. The survivors do not know they are becoming ancestors. That is part of the quiet power of the story. No one moving through an Ice Age valley, gathering shellfish on a vanished coast, carrying a sleeping child across dry ground, or watching smoke rise from a winter shelter, understands that their lives will one day stand behind continents of descendants. They are not founding nations. They are not carrying banners. They are not naming eras. They are doing what humans have always done under pressure: finding food, keeping children alive, remembering roots, repairing tools, avoiding danger, and trying to make tomorrow possible. Yet from these small acts, the world begins to widen. The populations that survive the dangerous passages beyond Africa grow, split, and adapt. Some remain near old routes. Others move into new valleys, forests, coasts, steppes, islands, and highlands. A group established in one refuge becomes the source of several daughter groups. A shoreline camp becomes part of a larger regional network. A population that once carried reduced diversity begins to accumulate new variation over time. The bottleneck does not vanish, but expansion follows it. Scarcity becomes ancestry. This is one of the strange rhythms of human history, and narrow beginning can produce immense variety. The out-of-Africa founders carried only part of Africa's older genetic diversity, but their descendants spread into environments so different that new adaptations, cultures, and identities formed across tens of thousands of years. In cold regions, bodies and behaviors adjusted to temperature, light, and diet. In highlands, oxygen became a challenge. In tropical forests, knowledge of plants and animals deepened. On islands, isolation shaped communities along coasts, tides, and marine foods remained central. On open plains, herds and seasonal movement structured life. The surviving thread did not stay one thread for long. It frayed into countless human worlds. The legacy of the migration is therefore not uniformity. It is relatedness through difference. People across Eurasia, Oceania, and later the Americas descend from branches of that ancient movement, but those branches change profoundly over time. Languages emerge and vanish. Tool traditions shift. Social systems develop in local ways. Myths, rituals, ornaments, and ways of reading the land become tied to particular places. The migrants' descendants do not remain eternal wanderers. They make homelands everywhere they endure, and still the old narrowness remains inside the story. Outside Africa, genetic diversity carries the signature of founder effects and bottlenecks. Neanderthal and Denisovan fragments remain as reminders of meetings with lost relatives. Some inherited variants help in certain environments. Others fade under selection. Later migrations mix populations again and again, complicating every simple map. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad shape is unmistakable. The ancestors who survived were filtered through small numbers, then multiplied across the planet. The phrase, "the survivors become ancestors," sounds calm, almost inevitable, but it hides a deeper truth. Every ancestor is also a survivor of alternatives that ended for one lineage to continue. Many others do not. This does not mean history is a contest with moral winners. It means reproduction is unforgiving. A skilled group can vanish. A lucky group can expand. A small community may leave descendants not because it was superior in every way, but because it stood in the right corridor when rain returned, found the right coast when inland food failed,
maintained the right alliances when isolation threatened, or survived a disaster that erased its neighbors. As these populations grow, the danger of immediate extinction lessens in some regions, but new challenges emerge. Larger networks can preserve knowledge better, yet they can also spread conflict and disease. Expanding groups encounter new climates and other human communities. They develop regional identities that may cooperate or compete. This same flexibility that once helped small bands survive will eventually allow humans to transform landscapes at increasing scales. Fire use, hunting pressure, mobility, and later technologies begin shaping ecosystems more visibly. The story of survival slowly becomes a story of influence. In Sahul, descendants of the first settlers build profound relationships with land and sea over tens of thousands of years, maintaining cultural continuities among the oldest on Earth. In Europe, later Ice Age peoples create ornaments, carved figures, painted caves, and complex hunting worlds under harsh climates. Across Asia, populations adapt to deserts, forests, mountains, rivers, and coasts, leaving traces still unevenly understood. In Africa, where the deepest human diversity remains, populations continue their own dynamic histories, interacting, moving, innovating, and contributing to later movements in ways that must not be overshadowed by the outward migration. Humanity is never one story in one direction. A lesser-known legacy of the ancient bottlenecks is that they shaped not only ancestry, but the later possibilities of adaptation when a small group carries only some variants. Natural selection in new environments works with that limited starting material, plus new mutations and occasional admixture. This can make the genetic history of a region partly the result of ancient chance. A variant present in the founders can become important later. A variant absent from them cannot help their descendants unless it arises again or enters through mixture. The deep path sets the menu from which later evolution chooses. This is why archaic admixture matters so much. Neanderthals and Denisovans had lived outside Africa for long periods before Homo sapiens arrived. They carried adaptations shaped by those environments. When modern humans interbred with them, some of that older experience entered the expanding population. It was not wisdom in the cultural sense, but biological inheritance. The vanished helped the survivors survive. The last human species became partly a vessel for the adaptations of the species it outlasted. This is not a simple replacement story. It is a story of absorption, loss, and continuation in fragments. Over time, the descendants of the migration become numerous enough that the old near failure disappears from ordinary awareness. A thriving population does not feel like the outcome of a bottleneck. People live in their present. They know their local ancestors, local landscapes, local histories. The narrow gate behind them is invisible. Only much later, when fossils, stones, climate records, and DNA are studied together, does the shape appear. The abundance of humanity rests on a foundation of scarcity. There is humility in that. Modern people often imagine ancestry as a chain of success, but deep ancestry is also a chain of accident survived. Every living person descends from people who avoided ending the line, generation after generation through plague, hunger, childbirth, violence, cold, heat, migration, and chance. The ancient out-of-Africa bottleneck is simply one of the most dramatic early examples. It reminds us that existence itself is not guaranteed by intelligence. It is a negotiated outcome. The survivors' descendants also carry forward the old human habit of movement. After the first great expansion, later migrations continue into northern Eurasia, across island chains, eventually into the Americas, across deserts and highlands, along rivers and coasts, back into regions already inhabited, mixing and remaking ancestry again. The first narrow migration becomes the foundation for countless later ones. Human history is not a settled tree after one dispersal. It remains a moving forest, but the psychological world of those first survivors remains mostly unreachable. We can infer technologies, routes, diets, and genes, but not the inner weight of what they experienced. Did they carry memories of Africa as a distant ancestral land after enough generations had passed? Did they know stories of a time of ash or darkness? Did they see Neanderthals or Denisvan as people, spirits, enemies, kin, or simply strangers? Did early coastal travelers understand that the sea could lead to new worlds? Or did each crossing feel like an exception, forced by need? The evidence cannot answer. What survives in the record suggests possibilities, not voices. Still, their legacy is everywhere. It is in the spread of Homo sapiens across the planet. It is in the reduced genetic diversity outside Africa. It is in the small percentages of archaic ancestry carried by living people. It is in the archaeological traces of camps, tools, pigments, shell mittens, and hearths. It is in the fact that one human species remains when once there were several. It is in the strange loneliness of modern humanity alone, but not purely alone. Because pieces of the others remain inside us. The migration that nearly wiped us out therefore becomes one of the great reversals in deep history. The same event that exposes our fragility also makes possible our reach. A population narrow enough to be vulnerable becomes a population widespread enough to reshape every continent it enters. The smalliness of the beginning does not reduce the achievement. It intensifies it. The world was not waiting. It was unstable, inhabited, dangerous, and indifferent. The survivors endured anyway. By the time their descendants are established across much of the old world, the old crisis has become background. The line no longer looks thin. It has become many lines, many peoples, many adaptations. But if one could trace those lines backward, through ice and forest, across coasts now drowned, through contact with lost humans, through green corridors and dry traps, through ash and bottleneck, they would converge toward a passage so narrow it is almost hard to believe. Not a single bridge, not one night of disaster, but a long narrowing, made of countless risks. And from that narrowing came the ancestors of multitudes. The survivors become ancestors, not because they escaped the ancient world, but because they learned to live inside its uncertainty. They did not conquer instability. They moved with it, endured it, and passed through it just enough times for their descendants to forget how close the line had come to breaking. Their success was not loud. It was cumulative. A child lived. A route was remembered. A fire stayed lit. A crossing succeeded. A meeting produced descendants. A drought was survived. A tool was taught. A group stayed connected, and slowly, from those almost invisible victories, the human future widened. The mystery beneath every map is not only where the first successful migrants went, but how many human roads disappeared before that one endured. Modern maps make the world look settled and knowable, with continents fixed in place and coastlines drawn as if they have always been there. But the Ice Age world was a different planet in human terms. Seas were lower, deserts shifted, Arabia could bloom and dry, the Sahara could open and close, Sunderland stretched where water now lies, rivers crossed plains that later drowned. The maps that mattered to the migrants were not maps of borders, but maps of water, food, danger, memory, and season. This is why the ancient migration still resists a single clean explanation. There was no one road, no one crisis, no one heroic band that can carry the whole story. The evidence points instead to a long and dangerous process. Repeated movements out of Africa, some successful only briefly, some leaving no descendants, some absorbed into later populations, and one great dispersal whose descendants spread across much of the world. Scholars still debate the timing, the routes, the scale of the bottlenecks, the importance of the coast, and the exact effects of Toba. The evidence remains incomplete, and in many places it may always remain incomplete, because the land itself has changed too much. The drowned coasts are among the greatest missing pages. If early humans moved along shorelines, then the most important camps may lie beneath modern seas. A shell heap, a hearth, a landing place, a trail between a freshwater spring and a tidal flat. All of it may be gone from sight. Inland archaeology gives us fragments, but perhaps not the heart of the journey. The sea that may have helped save the migrants also erased their footprints. Genetics gives another kind of map, but it too is partial. It shows bottlenecks, founder effects, Neanderthal ancestry, Denisvan ancestry, ghost lineages, and the deep diversity that remains strongest within Africa. Yet DNA cannot tell us what the first travelers felt when a route failed, when a child died, when strangers appeared near a spring, or when a storm cut off the shore behind them. It reveals the shape of survival, not the experience of it. What survives in the record suggests a story both grand and intimate, a species expanding across the world while repeatedly passing through moments when everything could have ended differently. The greatest mystery, then, is not whether humans were capable. They clearly were. The mystery is how often capability nearly was not enough. How many groups crossed into Arabia during green windows and vanished when the lakes dried? How many followed coasts now drowned? How many met Neanderthals or Denisvans and left no lasting line? How many early Homo sapiens populations reached new lands, lived there for thousands of years, and still disappeared from ancestry? The silence around these questions is not empty. It is crowded with lost human futures. And yet, one line continued, not untouched, not pure, not inevitable, but real. It carried African origins, archaic encounters, coastal knowledge, fire, tools, memory, and the fragile strength of social life. It passed through narrow gates and widened into continents of descendants. Every later city, language, voyage, monument, song, and story outside Africa rest partly on that passage through danger. The ancient migration nearly wiped us out because survival was never guaranteed. It was assembled from timing, luck, skill, climate, cooperation, and endurance. The people at the center of it did not know they were making history. They were simply trying not to disappear. And because they did not disappear, the world became human in a way no earlier age had been. Long after the ash settled, long after the green corridors dried, long after the first coastal camp slipped beneath rising seas, the human line kept moving. It moved into cold valleys, red deserts, tropical forests, island shores, mountain air, and open plains beneath enormous skies. It carried memories that eventually faded, tools that broke and were remade, names that vanished, and genes that still remain. The mystery is not solved completely, and perhaps it should not feel completely solved. Too much has been lost to water, weather, time, and silence. But enough remains to show the shape of something extraordinary. We are not the children of an easy rise. We are the descendants of narrow passages. Somewhere in the deep past, a small group found water when it needed water. Somewhere, a fire did not go out. Somewhere, a crossing succeeded. Somewhere, strangers became kin. Somewhere, a child survived a season that could have ended the line. These moments were not written down. They were not carved into monuments. They left no victory songs that we can hear, but they mattered more than most monuments ever would. The ancient migration that nearly wiped us out is still beneath every map, beneath every border, beneath every modern journey. It is there whenever the sea covers an old coast, whenever a desert hides a vanished lake, whenever DNA carries a fragment from a humankind no longer alive. It is there, in the quiet fact that humanity was once small enough for chance to matter terribly, and yet persistent enough to endure. At the end of the story, there is no single final footprint. There is only a shoreline at dusk, or a cold plain under stars, or a narrow path beside a drying lake. A few people move forward with what they can carry. Behind them, the old world closes. Ahead of them, the future waits without promise. They walk anyway,